And I'll do a roll call. Vice Chair Ambrose?
Present.
Commissioner Lee?
Here.
Commissioner Smith?
Yes.
Okay, all here. Agenda item number 2, public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda.
Commissioners, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. Know your rights under the Sunshine Ordinance. That admonition is printed on every copy of every agenda for every meeting of this commission, which might only seem ironic, but is in fact blatantly hypocritical. This body has no intention of even following the law, let alone enforcing it. I have 36 orders of determination, along with at least a dozen complaints that I have filed directly with the Ethics Commission, and every single one of those has been denied by the Ethics Commission. In fact, you have never enforced a Sunshine Ordinance finding. Former Ethics Commissioner Quentin Kopp, who I consider the hypocrite in chief, said as much after resigning. Quote, "I don't think anyone is afraid of the Ethics Commission who is in the competitive political life in San Francisco." The civil grand jury (2010-2011) wrote this 8 years ago. Because of the Ethics Commission's lack of enforcement, no city employee has been disciplined for failing to adhere to the Sunshine Ordinance. The Commission has allowed some city officials to ignore the rulings of the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force. I would submit it's one case worse. The task force does its job and it makes its findings, and then they send them over here for enforcement, and you have found in hypocritical ways way to turn it around and say, oh no, the task force got it wrong. So far I've had 7 complaints come here from the task force, and in every single case, your answer has been to the task force, you got it wrong. And I'll tell you, they have been the most unfair, unequal hearings that I've ever experienced in my life. Thomas Aquinas teaches that willful ignorance of what one ought to know is a mortal sin. It's also illegal. Those 36 orders of determination, that's not all I have. I have additional ones, but it gets to the point where the print's so small you can't read them. And every one of those is at a minimum 1 misdemeanor. And if anybody can fairly claim that they have a government conspiracy working against them, I think I can, because I have documented proof of it. When I go to public meetings, I have had my public comment interfered with so often it is unfunny. I've had it abridged, restricted, you can name it. And I have fought, and you will see I will give a 150-word summary to the staff, and this is going to go in your minutes. I'm the only citizen in the city and county of San Francisco who actually has his words, his constitutionally protected political free speech, make it into your agenda.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Ellen Lee Zhao. My name is right here, because a lot of times you pronounce it Zhu. I am a government social worker for more than 10 years with public health. I am a SEIU 1021 union delegate for government employees. Our union has about 16,000 government employees. I am also the Director of Public Relations for the California Civic Grand Jury Association, the San Francisco chapter. The qualification for that I have to be the Civic Grand Jury before, which I agree with the gentleman who spoke before me. Our government has been corrupt. Our Ethics Commission department has been corrupt. I have been a resident for more than 33 years in San Francisco. I care about my city. I am trained to follow law and ethics for our government. I have been coming here to the Ethics Commissioners many times in 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. The last time I was here was last month, April 12, 2019. I reported to you possible corruptions within the public officials from election office, from election process, such as voting fraud, ballot harvesting, monoparty, Democrats only for the last 45 years in San Francisco, pay to play through Super PAC, that you have been continue to approve, increase millions and millions of public dollars to help the corrupted system. Today, I came before you demanding ethics commissions to investigate corruptions within ethics commissions. As a union substitute for government employees, I brought 5 government employees to Ethics Commission to report bribery, extortion, harassment, and retaliation between April 2017 to July 2017. I later was informed by Jeffries right here in front of me that our file was missing. Our audio tape never found. Nobody ever went there. In fact, we have 6 employees, including myself, reported extortion, bribery. And today I came before you again. This is not only criminal, but also killing those public employees who have good conducts, follow good government employee conducts to report it to you about bribery. You all remember I came in here with a bunch of public employees, reported to you the FBI has been investigated since 2011, or maybe before that. And today I brought you that, because you have new people in here, I brought you that today. It showed that the FBI was investigating the public employees, management selling the jobs to extort people, millions and millions. You need to do something about it. And it is all public information. I'm going to give you that for public record. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Commissioners. I'm Debbie Lerman. I'm with the San Francisco Human Services Network, an association of about 80 San Francisco health and human service nonprofits. Most of our members contract with the city and county to provide services. I am here today to speak briefly around item 5, the ACAO regulations, and I apologize that I cannot stay. What I want to say today is that most of the requirements in the ACAO fall on public officials and campaign professionals who receive specialized training and have expertise. But a few of the requirements in the ACAO fall on members of the general public who are far less likely to be informed, which leads to potential noncompliance and penalties. And therefore, I would like, as part of this regulatory process, to ask the staff and ask the Commissioner to instruct the staff to develop plain language materials to facilitate compliance. Specifically, I have 3 suggestions. On Campaign Code 1.126, the newly expanded requirement to ban campaign contributions, and also requiring contractors to inform their affiliates of the ban. I would like to ask that this department develop a fact sheet that explains the requirements, has that sample language in it, and work with perhaps the city attorney and the Office of Contract Administration to make sure that that fact sheet is included in all bid packets. Secondly, around behested payments, sections 3.610, 20, and 30. The way that it is envisioned as working is that when a public official solicits a behested payment, the public official is supposed to tell the donor about the reporting requirement, and if applicable, the donor is supposed to tell the recipient. We have been concerned about what happens if the public official doesn't inform the donor, and we would have liked to see a safe harbor in that situation. But at minimum, we want to see that required notice from the public official to the donor, and then from the donor to the recipient, be in writing. So again, a simple fact sheet that the public official would be required to give to the donors in those situations that explains exactly what the donor's supposed to do and how to log into the system. The third thing I want to say is that all of the forms should be put online. I know that you're e-filing, but because members of the public aren't used to these forms, there should be a way to look up the form in advance before you fill it out so you have everything ready. And I'm unable to find forms online anymore. It's all log into the system and e-file. So that would be a very helpful thing for the public. I urge these steps to facilitate and improve compliance and protect members of the public who may not be aware. And thank you for considering these ideas.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, may I
Yes.
ask Ms. Newman? Thank you very much for your comments, but would you offer the members of your network to assist staff in rolling out the fact sheets and public information?
I would
It's
be
ready?
perfectly happy to do that. I have an outdated fact sheet on 1.126 that I've used for years and would love to update it with the more recent requirements, would love to work with staff, and would happily distribute it to our members. But there are many nonprofits who are not our members as well, who should be informed, as well as for-profits who contract. But thank you, yeah, I'm available.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. Okay, any other public comment on agenda item number 2? Okay. Agenda item number 3, which is the consent calendar, the draft minutes for the Ethics Commission's April 12th, 2019 regular meeting. Any public comment on this? No? Is there a motion to approve the minutes? There's a motion to approve from Commissioner Lee and a second from Commissioner Ambrose. All in favor? Aye. It's approved unanimously. Agenda item number 4, discussion and possible action on public finance program, phase 2 legislative recommendations. So this is, we'll hear for a minute from Mr. Ford, but this has been a long process that's kicked off last year, and a lot of work has gone into it, both on the staff side as well as engagement from the public, a lot of thoughtful discussion, and a lot of great analysis has gone in as well. And I for one, am grateful for this robust dialogue that we have had going on. And we may not always agree, but I hope that everyone has felt that they've had the opportunity to engage and be heard. So I think that there's a lot of support in the room based on the public comment that I have received to date. I believe my fellow commissioners have as well. And I think there's a lot of momentum going forward, and look forward to hearing from Mr. Ford on the outstanding items on the ordinance yet, and that we can have a good dialogue and like to hear from the public, but would then be able to take a vote today. And I would love to send this off to the Board of Supervisors before the end of the month. So with that, Mr. Ford, please take it away.
Thank you, Chair Chu, members of the commission. Thanks for the nice intro on this item. As you mentioned, we brought these recommendations to you at the April meeting in concept form. We delivered a report that had findings and recommendations of the research that we have done over the fall or the preceding 3 or 4 months, and how we think those findings would translate into specific legislative recommendations to strengthen the city's public financing program. I will skip straight to page 14, which has those recommendations summarized in a list format. Also glad to talk about the material in section 2. Those are research findings that are tailored to inquiries from the commission at the last meeting. So I'm sure you've had a chance to look at that, but if you have any questions, glad to talk about it. But I think for purposes of my comments, I'll talk specifically to the recommendations that start on page 14. And as you mentioned, Chair Chu, I'll highlight those that so far there doesn't seem to be consensus amongst the public, staff, and commission. So the first recommendation is to...
Pat,
yes.
before you go there, if we
Sure.
could just stop briefly in section 2
Sure.
on the appropriation amount as well as the election fund. So a couple things. One, I'd like I'm sure you would do this anyway, but would like to ask that the commission continue to monitor and report on the state, the level of the fund as we head into the election season. And I know there'll be a report at the end as how much was utilized, et cetera. But there was, it came in public comment, and we had talked about this at our last meeting because there was a concern about the depletion of the funds and that there is the ability to make supplemental appropriations. And we had included language, I think, in the April report about incorporating a requirement that the fund be, re-upped, if you will. Could you speak to that point, since it's not contained in the current recommendations?
Yes, so that recommendation in April was essentially to harmonize the appropriation language between two separate kinds of appropriations. One is the baseline annual appropriation that is based on a formula of $2.75 per city resident that is appropriated to the fund at the beginning of each fiscal year. The language there is something to the effect of the city shall appropriate such funds. In a separate code section, there's the supplemental appropriation, which says that the commission may request a supplemental appropriation from the board and the mayor if the fund's balance is below a certain amount as of August 1st. Essentially, the ED, executive director, reports to the board whether or not that minimum balance is met, and then the commission may make that request pursuant to the statute. Our initial recommendation was that the language be harmonized so that in the supplemental language, it also say that the city and county shall appropriate such funds. But at the advice of the city attorney, we have not included that language in the draft ordinance. I'd probably like to let Deputy City Attorney Shen speak to the specifics if you'd like to know why. But at their advice, we did not include that recommendation.
Okay. Deputy City Attorney Shen, is it possible to share your reasoning as to why we can't include that language?
Sure, briefly.
Yeah.
So the budgeting and appropriation process in the city is set forth in the city charter. And so any ordinance that purports to sort of make any required appropriations to a specific purpose is kind of, at the end of the day, kind of a request. It's not really informal. It's not really binding on sort of the decision makers. Under the charter, only the board needs to enact appropriations as it sees fit. And so, including that language in the ordinance creates, I guess, kind of a false expectation that it is truly binding on the city to make those appropriations.
Right, so only the House of Representatives shall have the power of the purse. But maybe we can declare a national emergency, city emergency.
Something like that. And I think it's best not to create such expectations. And I think it goes without saying that at any time, if the Ethics Commission staff level or the Commission sees fit to make further requests of the board to appropriate further funds as needed for the election campaign fund, we can always do so.
Thank you.
I actually, if you don't mind, because I was also concerned about this, I think it is going to be really important then to carefully monitor the status of the fund, especially as we're making changes in the match requirements and increasing the levels. Because while we can ask for a supplemental appropriation, we might not get one approved. And as I understood it, there's not a lot of clarity around how we would go back to people who had expectations of receiving a certain amount of funds, only to learn at what would be potentially the very last moment that, in fact, the bank was empty and there weren't going to be any funds, and how you would prorate that across expectant recipients. And while we've never come close to that, I just think as we make these changes, it's going to be important. And I wouldn't wait till August to do that, because just with the board calendar and they're on recess in August, I mean, you could find yourself, well into October and November before they could even act on a supplemental appropriation. So maybe move that back a bit, where you report to us about what the levels are if we're getting close to the edge. And I guess we would know by June anyway how many candidates, and could kind of do some ballpark estimates of where that was going to go. So I would think that would be a better time frame for checking in.
Yes, and I can speak a little bit to what we've done to understand the fund up to this point. We've worked with the Controller's Office and with the Mayor's Office, our budget analysts in the Mayor's Office, to understand how they are interpreting the annual appropriation, and to make sure that their understanding of it is the same as ours, which is that it is an annual appropriation that's $2.75 per resident. We've confirmed that that is their understanding, so we intend to closely monitor that each year and make sure that our numbers line up, that everyone understands how much money is going into the fund and why. So that part is definitely in place. We have a plan for that. And then as to the fund being exhausted potentially by these reforms, what we found in our research is that, and we conveyed this in the April memo, we were shooting for changes that would not drastically outstrip the annual appropriation. We looked at a 4-year cycle. If you can, kind of create a 4-year cycle where each of the 11 supervisorial districts and the mayor's seat will come up for election, and you'll have 4 annual appropriations. That's kind of how we looked at it. So we were trying to have those come out equal, the amount of money that would come in and the amount of money that would go out. We did also find that there's a surplus in the fund right now, so that if that amount were more during one 4-year cycle, there would probably be enough to cover it. So I think what we intend to do is to watch that process unfold, and as we start to experience elections, if you and the board and the mayor were to approve these new reforms, we would monitor the amount of money going out. And if we saw that surplus start to dwindle and go down, I think that would trigger us to have to start thinking about what would we do if this were to run out. I think at this point, we feel that we've hopefully struck that balance, that the amount of money coming in and going out will roughly equate, so we won't have that problem, but that's our plan. If we do encounter that a couple years down the road, it would be more like 3 or 4 years down the road to explore those kinds of options.
Okay, great.
And I certainly think that based on the maximum amounts of funding that a Board of Supervisors candidate and mayoral candidates can receive, there were 2 options in the April meeting. That one would be a little bit over if everyone maxed out, but not all candidates max out. But under the current scenario, I think that if every candidate, based on historical data, maxes out, that the fund would still be able to sustain the full funding.
That's what we find, yes. And as you'll see in this report for this meeting, we've coalesced on a number that's between those two. So rather than presenting you with 2 alternatives for the candidates' maximum funding amounts, we tried to present you with one proposal that we think represents the best of both worlds. It's both robust, would give candidates strong financial footing to run a competitive campaign, but it's also financially feasible, and we don't think that it would exhaust the fund based on what we've seen in the past in terms of participation rates. So hopefully this is something that you agree with, and be glad to talk about methodology there, but that's why that recommendation is what it is. So I guess before I go on to the recommendations, did you have any other questions about Section 2 and kind of the responses to the inquiries from last month?
A little bit off topic of the actual ordinance, but since Seattle will be going through another iteration of its voucher program, so when you have more information at the end of the November election cycle, it'll be very interesting to get an update on how their program is going, since it'll be their sophomore effort.
Yep, we are monitoring that. I'd be glad to include something maybe in the policy report.
January or... Yeah.
Sure. So I will move on to Section 3 and briefly recap the legislative recommendations. I should have mentioned that these recommendations are also contained in Attachment 1, which is a draft ordinance that is available for you to take action on today, if you so choose. These represent our recommendations that appeared last month, with the exception of that supplemental appropriation concept that we discussed a moment ago. The first recommendation is to match only up to $100 of a contribution, but to match it at a 6-to-1 ratio. An alternative that we've researched since the last meeting, and that's analyzed here in this report, is to match up to $150. I'll come back to this after I'm done going through the list. Secondly is to increase the initial grant to $60,000 for supervisorial candidates and $300,000 for mayoral candidates. Third, to increase the maximum funding that candidates can receive. And you can see that for supervisorial candidates, we met kind of in the middle between the 2 numbers from last month, which were $210,000 and $270,000. In discussions with stakeholders, including Supervisor Marr's office, we found that this number in the middle would hopefully achieve what we were going for. And you'll also see this is a new feature of the recommendation since last month, that we included slightly lower funding maximums for incumbents. That's a feature that currently exists in the program, that incumbents are only able to secure slightly less than what non-incumbent candidates are able to get. So we thought we would preserve that feature, with the policy idea being that non-incumbent candidates require a little bit more financial support in order to run a competitive campaign, so that they need a little bit more help through the program to be competitive. And then for mayoral candidates, you'll see that we included the $1.2 million number, the slightly lower number for incumbents. Fourth, we propose to increase the initial individual expenditure ceilings to $350,000 for supervisorial candidates and $1.7 million for mayoral candidates. And these, of course, are just the initial amounts. We have an adjustable spending limit mechanism, so that means that the candidates can experience adjustments upwards from those numbers. And fifth, at the top of page 15, is to allow the initial grant to the candidates to be distributed earlier, specifically on the 284th day instead of the 142nd day, as is the case under current law, but to require that all other funds, matching funds, may still only be distributed upon the 142nd day before the election or later. And the grant represents about 25% of the total funds available to candidates under the program. Sixth, this is kind of a fix to the statute, is to align the language regarding qualification for supervisorial and mayoral candidates. Right now, supervisorial candidates and mayoral candidates differ on whether or not they can use contributions that were collected on the 70th day before the election. So this would fix that discrepancy so that both kinds of candidates can use those contributions. We believe that was probably the intent of the drafters of the code, but that was not executed in the code, so this would change that. And lastly, this is also a new recommendation since last month, is to require that supervisorial candidates file threshold reports upon raising or spending $10,000 rather than $5,000. And I'll briefly explain this since this is a new proposal. Candidates file threshold reports when they spend or receive funds that reach certain thresholds. The purpose is for administration of the public financing program. The initial thresholds are filed so that we know whether or not there's a candidate in the race who has met the threshold that needs to be met in order for us to qualify an opponent. So it's one of the qualification requirements in order for you to receive public financing, that as a supervisorial candidate, you must be opposed by someone who's already raised $10,000. And for mayoral candidates, you must be opposed by someone who's raised $50,000. For mayoral candidates, the initial threshold report is pegged to that $50,000 number. So we know once we get one of those, it's okay for us to qualify someone in the race. For supervisorial candidates, you'll see that the code does not align. The $10,000 figure is used for what an opponent needs to raise in order for a candidate to be qualified. The threshold report is pegged at $5,000, so they don't match. So it's not fulfilling that purpose. It has been a practice of candidates to file at $10,000, since that is the intent of the statute. But this would fix the discrepancy and allow us to actually require that of candidates. So I want to go back to two items in this list that I mentioned are the ones that consensus has not yet been reached. The first is item 1, which is to provide $100, or rather to match up to $100 of a contribution. So what this means, again, is under the current program, when a candidate is trying to qualify for the program, even if they receive a contribution of $400 or $500, we will only count up to $100 for purposes of that candidate qualifying. So a candidate would have to receive $100 contributions if they're running for supervisor in order to qualify. However, when they do qualify and then they move on to the matching phase, they're able to submit anything up to $500, $500 being the statutory contribution limit, and we will match anything up to the full $500. This proposal is to extend that $100 limit across the whole program. so that candidates would only ever be able to have up to $100 of a contribution matched. The policy purpose of this was basically to mirror the same policy purpose for why this rule exists in the qualification phase, which is to ensure that the candidates have a broad base of support and to encourage them to pursue contributions from a broader base of individuals, including people who cannot afford to contribute more than $100. We find that after the qualification phase, under current law, there's not a good incentive that encourages candidates to pursue those smaller contributions. So we found that by extending the $100 limit to all contributions matched under the program, and by pairing that with the 6-to-1 match, we would still be giving candidates a very strong financial base to run a competitive campaign, but we would be incentivizing them to pursue those smaller contributions. So rather than receiving a smaller number, or I should say pursuing a smaller number of larger contributions, they would pursue a larger number of smaller contributions. We heard public comment at the last meeting and inquiry from commissioners about whether or not a higher amount would also serve this purpose. So we researched using $150 as that limit instead of 100, and we find that this alternative, although in our opinion not as good as $100, would still be an improvement, and we believe that it would still be economically feasible. It would probably result in giving slightly more funds to candidates, only because now instead of matching 6-to-1 up to $100, we'd be matching 6-to-1 up to $150. That could mean that some candidates could get more money than they otherwise would. But we find that that would still be most likely within the program's funding. And we also find that that would still give candidates an incentive to pursue smaller contributions. We think that this is a reasonable compromise and that it would probably, consensus could probably be built around the $150 number, although we think that anything beyond $150 starts to significantly harm that incentive. That if you go beyond $150 and make it so that $500 contributions have the same impact, or would have the same impact or same value under the proposals as under current law, there wouldn't be a very strong incentive for candidates to pursue smaller contributions. They would still be most likely to pursue $500 contributions. But I wanted to just highlight that we did provide this alternative, so we think that this would still serve the purpose if you opted for $150 instead of $100. So secondly, I wanted to speak about item 5 in the list. This is the recommendation to change the earliest date on which the initial grant may be distributed from the 142nd day before the election to the 284th day before the election. Again, the idea behind this, the policy purpose, was to try to give candidates early money, but to limit it to only 25% of the total funds so that it was a balanced approach. We heard from stakeholders who both opposed and supported this change. Some stakeholders supported having all funds available earlier in the election. Some supported keeping the date the same as it is now for all funds. We thought that our recommendation was a compromised approach that would make only a limited portion available earlier in the election while keeping the same 142nd day limit for 75% of the funds. And in our conversations with candidates and campaign managers during our research phase, we heard that this would help candidates to start building the infrastructure of their campaign early. But we felt it was also important to try and limit, for most of the funds, limit them to only after the nomination period had closed, that they would be able to access those funds. So that's why we approached this in the way that we did. We provided some information in this report about how other jurisdictions have approached the question of when is the appropriate time to distribute public funds to candidates, or I should say, what's the appropriate time at the earliest to allow funds to be distributed to candidates. We provided some of that information in this report. Mr. Cox has some further information to provide to you on that. But before he does, I did just want to point out that the jurisdictional information, for one, is provided to you in response to your inquiry for it at the last meeting, but is also, in our eyes, just for comparison's purpose. It's not to say, yes, we should do it, or no, we shouldn't do it. I think it's not clear how well these approaches are working in other jurisdictions. And it was certainly our experience from speaking to folks in this jurisdiction, candidates and campaign managers, that earlier would be better for them. So that was our process. We find that even if it's the case that San Francisco is on the earlier end right now, that is not a reason to not have a 25% portion of the funds be available earlier. Again, it's not clear how well this is working in other jurisdictions, but we did want to provide you with that information about other jurisdictions. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Cox momentarily so he can speak about that.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Thank you, Commissioners. I just wanted to highlight a couple of jurisdictions that we did some additional research on, New York City, Seattle, and Los Angeles. And we looked at the 2021 election cycle for New York City. And our research found that public funds are distributed in February, or would be distributed in February for that election, where the general election is in November. So that, that's a significant time gap. We looked at Seattle, of course, and found that their democracy vouchers are available for distribution in February as well, with a general election date in November, the first week in November typically. We also looked at Los Angeles, and although their system is slightly different with primary and a general election, they make public funds available following the certification of their primary elections. I would also point out that though both New York City, Seattle, and Los Angeles, they all have primaries, New York City and Seattle give or distribute public funds before their primaries as well. So that kind of gives some context to our proposals and nesting our early distribution date kind of in that general framework.
So, Mr. Cox, do these jurisdictions do what we do, which is do an initial grant and then the balance of the funds later, or is it all upfront, and then they have to continue to qualify?
Sure, they have a ramp-up approach. I would categorize it that way. Their systems are slightly different from ours in terms of initial grant, but typically the public funds are not all distributed initially. They are distributed over time.
And is it after all the candidates have been determined for the election?
So that's not something that we looked at specifically, so I can't provide you with an answer to that, but what we looked at was just whether they distribute funds, how far in front of the election that they looked at it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. So I think the last point I would make on this item is that we still support it. We still think it would be an improvement over current law. However, we acknowledge that there is not consensus in the community around this proposal. And our stance on it is that it would be an improvement. However, if it were not part of this package, the package as a whole would still be a very strong set of reforms. We think it would still have a significant impact on public financing and a positive impact. However, we do think this would further that impact. So I think that concludes the comments that I wanted to make about this. So glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Commissioners, Commissioner Smith?
I have a question, and it has to do with the incumbent, non-incumbent differential. Now that the maximum dollars have been raised, it appears to me that the difference between the amount the incumbents get versus the non-incumbents is so small that I'm wondering if it's a distinction without a difference, or a difference without a distinction, whichever way that goes. And whether it, if it's significant to help the non-incumbents, then maybe the amount ought to be significant, and if it's not, then maybe we ought to drop it. I understand it was there before, but is that a good enough reason to keep it there now?
Yeah, I definitely agree that the differences are not large. They're not large under current law. I think that they used to be larger. I think if you look back at the history of the code, and it's evolved over many years, at one time there was a bigger difference. And it's hard to know what the board and the commission were thinking at that time to reduce that difference. But I mean, our approach was to keep it the same as it is for right now, only because it's hard to go either way. It's hard to say No, we think they should get the same amount because it is the case that incumbents, or I should say non-incumbents, require a little bit more support in order to run a competitive campaign. But it's also hard to try and widen that gap, only because there are potential constitutional concerns when you treat candidates differently. It's not a valid governmental interest to level the playing field. So we try and avoid mechanisms that carry that out. We try to assess what candidates take in order to lead a competitive campaign, and we seek to provide them with that through the program.
There wasn't any opposition to that approach that in the public comments that I received or anything, but I was just curious about it because when I looked at the two different numbers, they seemed relatively insignificant to me, and I was interested in the background. Thank you.
Other commissioners, other questions, or Commissioner Ambrose?
If I may, just as a plain English practical matter, looking at your advanced distribution, if as proposed, a candidate were to receive an initial grant 284 days before, I gather then that they would be getting money even before they demonstrated that they were qualified for public funds, because we wouldn't allow them to submit their qualifying contributions until 9 months before, or 9 months before exactly 284 days, and then we have 30 days to figure out. So was that the idea, that you could just put your name in without any qualifying contributions and get an initial 25% grant?
No, we would still seek to certify the candidates beforehand.
Okay, and then just so I'm clear, how I know it's 25%, but since the other number's moving, how much would they, how many dollars is that?
So we're proposing that the initial grant be $60,000 for supervisorial candidates, $300,000 for mayoral candidates.
Yeah, okay, so, but then, and then as a practical matter, if they were to then decide that they're not in the game, they would owe the city $60,000? Is that the, okay. I think I'm okay to take public comment, because I know there's.
Commissioner Lee, did you have?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have I just want to ask Mr. Ford to walk through again, because it's already in the report, the difference between $150 and $100 contribution. You already have the charts, but if you can walk us through again, the difference.
Yes.
Two.
I think the best chart to look at is on page 12. This chart compares 3 different approaches. The first approach in the left-hand column is if only up to $100 can be matched, and this is all at a 6-to-1 rate. The middle column is if up to $150 is matched. The last column is if up to $200 is matched. And what's being compared within each example is a $100 contribution and a $500 contribution. So if up to $100 is matched at a 6-to-1 rate, you can see the value that the candidate would obtain is $700 for a $100 contribution. That's the $100 contribution itself, plus the $600 of public funds that would be distributed, comes out to $700 of value for the candidate. For a $500 contribution, since only up to $100 can be matched, and it's matched at a 6-to-1 rate, that means that same number, $600, is what the candidate would receive from the city. So adding those together, you get $1,100. That greatly decreases the discrepancy between the values of those contributions, which to start with was 5-to-1, $500 to $100. But after being matched through the public financing program, that discrepancy comes out to 11 to 7, which is less than 200%. So from 500% to somewhere in the neighborhood of 140%. In the middle example, you see if that matchable portion is increased to $150. So again, the $100 contribution is matched 6 to 1, becomes $700. The $500 contribution, now up to $150 of that contribution can be matched. So that results in $900 of public financing. So when that's added together, you get $1,400. So that's a 200% difference there between the 700 and the 1,400. And then we also included a dotted line there at 1,500, which represents, under current law, the value of a $500 contribution that gets matched. It gets matched at a 2-to-1 rate, resulting in $1,000 of public funds. When that's added to the $500 contribution, you get $1,500 of value to the candidate. So we put that there just as a comparison, since that's one of the main concerns we've heard through public comment, is that the value of a $500 contribution would be lessened under staff's proposal. We showed this here that the difference is quite small at the $150 level. We think it's even appropriate at the $100 level to have the value of those contributions reduced to $1,100. We did find in our research that for all candidates who received public financing in 2018, that under our proposal of matching only up to $100, all of the candidates would have received more funds under the program. No candidate would have received less. So we were looking at it from that perspective, not whether or not each individual contribution that the candidate had matched would receive at least as much or more under the program, but rather whether or not the candidate would receive at least as much or more. And we found that that was the case. So although we think that the first example, $100, is appropriate, that represents a good allotment of the program's funds between small and large contributions, we think $150 is also appropriate. And we think that it's probably more likely to have consensus gather around it because this $1,400 number is much closer to $1,500.
And the point that you made about looking back at the actual experience but applying the new rule, I assume that's because most of those candidates receive contributions of less than $500.
So no candidate submits all $500 contributions, and no candidate submits all 100. It's always a blend. Some
Right,
are
of
weighted
course.
more heavily one way or the other. So for some candidates, they would experience a much greater benefit under our proposals than others because some candidates have so many more of those small contributions. But for all candidates, the proposals would result in them receiving more, meaning that even for the candidates who had submitted a lot of $500 contributions, and those contributions would have gotten slightly less, their smaller contributions would be matched at a high enough rate that overall they would be getting more under the program.
Okay, that's what I was understanding about the math. Okay, thank you.
Right. I think the balance is that at $100, you would need to get more contributions of $100 to get to your max versus $150, just because $150 is $50 more than the 100. So to me, $150 strikes the right balance between giving weight to smaller contributions without taking 40% away from the $500 contribution, because I think, as Mr. Ford said, there is a wide range, right? Not everyone gives 500, and not everyone gives 100. So I think that it's to me is a good compromise.
And to that point, if I may, we looked at what was the minimum number of contributions that a candidate would have to submit in order to get $155,000, a supervisorial candidate. $155,000 is the most that a candidate can get right now. The smallest number of contributions, theoretically, that you could submit, if you submitted all $500 contributions, would be 190. So a candidate has to submit minimum 190 contributions, and they all have to be $500 contributions. in order to get $155,000 currently under the program. Under our proposal, if up to $150 were matched, the candidate would only have to submit 172
At 150.
at 150. So not only is the number smaller, 172 contributions instead of 190, the number is also, the value of each contribution is much smaller. Those are $150 contributions instead of $500 contributions, and both of those get you to $155,000
Because of the higher ratio.
because of the higher ratio, exactly.
Okay. The other question I had is with respect to the date. So this chart is very helpful, I understand, it's for informational purposes and not necessarily a recommendation. And I look at Seattle and I think that's a fundamentally different model from what we're doing because citizens are given vouchers and the candidates and the citizens, will need additional time to be able to contribute their vouchers. So, and also only in the second year of that program. And I look at New York, LA, Long Beach, and, we're, with New York City under the current regime at 142 days, and to go to 284 would seem, to me anyway, to be an outlier from the others. Not that we have to be with the rest of the pack, but I think it's informative, and so I just would, and also I think that there's been a lot of the public comment around wanting to keep the date, and part of the reason being there's a lot of moving pieces, changing the match, changing the amounts, changing the max, and that 142 days seems to be working quite well right now. And while I do like the idea very much of providing candidates funds earlier in order to, give air, and I think one campaign manager said it's like yeast, all things will rise from that. Proceeding with prudence and caution, I think, has merit as well. Commissioner Ambrose.
I can, one more, and not to comment on that, I know there's a lot of public comment on that issue that we'll hear, but just a basic issue, when do we think this pack, assuming we can get to consensus and pass it out today, what is the operative date? Is this going in effect for November? Because we've got a hurry up schedule then with the board, and that would essentially require consensus with the board. I don't know that there'd be time for something to bounce back here and get through before the recess, et cetera. So,
I don't
but it
think
doesn't
that-
say.
Well, it doesn't say, but I haven't, but I wouldn't expect it would be in time for the November 2020 election at all, right? I mean, this would be for 2020.
Yes,
Okay.
so our plan from the beginning of the project was for the phase one changes to go into effect for this year's election, which I didn't provide you an update on that. That ordinance was approved and will go into, or I should say, become operative on June 9th. So that will affect this year's election. However, for the phase two changes, was our intention that this would not affect 2019's election, that it would affect 2020's election. And I did have a chance to chat with Mr. Shen before the meeting. He suggested that we do include an operative date, which I think is wise. So that's something that I would propose be amended in the ordinance, is that it have an operative date of January 1st, 2020.
Okay, thanks. That's what I wanted to know, so we could be clear and not have it come back.
I'm sorry, January 1st, 2020?
Yes.
All right, thanks.
Right, if I could just add in terms of process, I think we can make that amendment at this meeting and still move it forward
Okay.
from today if, again, there's consensus on the other issues. And again, the concern is that, we just didn't want these changes to kick in on, say, September, October, while
Yeah,
there's a
no,
couple of
it's-
elections on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other For public comment?
I'd like to second what the chair said about changing the dispersal date. I haven't been on the commission very long, but I've been impressed with the amount of data that's normally presented about backing up the staff's recommendations and things. And it does seem to me that this particular one really isn't based on data. It's more of we just think it would be a good idea. And there are a lot of changes being put into effect and right now, and I can't help but wonder if it wouldn't be good to see, assuming those other changes go through, what effect those have, and whether that solves part of the problem or responds in part to your concern, rather than adding it now, with, as I say, without, and it does put us, I think, into an outlier position.
Any other comments? Okay. I would like to invite public comment on agenda item number 4.
Good afternoon. My name is Ellen Lee Zhao. I am a public employee. I am also a special candidate for mayor last year, 2018. I went through the process, and I realized our government has been not only corrupted, and it has been bought, sold, and through super PAC. That's exactly I am here today to oppose. No public fund should be allowed because it's organized crime. Because I've been through it, I watched it. Last year, according to what you report, ethics commissioners, $4.16 million wasted government money to help the Democrats. Nothing, no one, no Libertarian, no Republican, no Green Party, no Independent, no nonpartisan, nothing, not a zip at all. Only Democrats. According to what the United States Constitution, our government has been failed. We have a lot of people died on the street, a lot of people illegally staying in here protected by nothing but Democrats. The public funds should not be given to anybody because it's public waste and it's helping the criminals. According to what you know, the United States Constitution, the sanctuary law, it's illegal. It's protecting criminals from us. We are not feeling safe. Our crime is regularly high. Our car break-ins more than 100 every day. And our government has been bought and paid. For example, cannabis is still illegal according to the federal. But because there's only one monoparty, nothing but Democrats, the government raised $4.16 million 2018. This year, you just talk about it right in front of people's eyes, right here, right now. You quoted LA, you quoted New York, you quoted Long Beach, and you quoted Seattle. Seattle is a dying city. There's a document that says dying Seattle. And San Francisco, it's a dying city right now because of the crime, because of the monoparty that is Democrats only, no other political power to balance people's voice, political voice. We are done. And you also quote New York. New York is very famous with killing babies. They are not for people. And you also quoted Los Angeles. Los Angeles has more than 60,000 homeless. And California has 180,000 homeless. Our state is done, finished, under Gavin Newsom. Our political power has been bought and paid through super PAC, and you're talking about more public money. I am strongly opposed on behalf of many districts, 11 of them. And many of the opposed people, they're not here today. And I want you to think about what you do. Killing the people's voice. No public finance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Stephen Hill. It's a pleasure to be before you again, and it has been a long road, and we've had many good conversations, sometimes hard conversations, but it's glad to see things are, at least we're here and try to see if we have consensus on enough to move forward to the board. As I've been saying all along, writing any good policy is a matter of balance. Some goals conflict. Both of them good goals, and they conflict. And we've had to face that again and again, not only this round of public financing, but in many previous rounds that I've been involved in, going back to the year 2000. And specifically, I want to talk about the amount of matchable contributions as well as the disbursement date. When it comes to the matchable contributions, what has not been brought into this conversation, much to my frustration, is the impact on candidates when they have to seek a lot more contributions in order to get the full amount of public financing. The Budget and Legislative Analyst of the Board of Supervisors has a report that seems to conflict with what Mr. Ford just told us about how many contributions it's going to take. So we need to get some sort of reconciliation on this to find out whose numbers are right. What the BLA said was that they compared the current program as we're putting forward and what would be the impact on a $500 donation and a $200 donation. And we're all trying to empower small donors, for sure. That's one of the good goals. But we also are trying to make sure that candidates aren't doing dialing for dollars because they now need so many more contributions that they spend all their time fundraising. No one wants that, I presume. So what the BLA found was that the number of donations between a $500 donation, if that was matchable, and $200 would go up from the current 200 donations that you need to 263. So that's a 31.5% increase in the number of donations that candidates would need if we had a $200 matchable level. If you go down to 150 or 100, those candidates are going to need even more contributions in order to reach the full amount of public financing. So I think we really have to find the balance here. And if we had a contribution, a matchable contribution amount of $166.66, that would be the exact amount that you would need, the same amount as if with a $500 donation in terms of how much they would be worth. And I'm about out of time, and I haven't even gotten through most of my points. But so I'm just trying to say that we have to find the balance here. And I think on this one, I would like to see us lean more towards 200 if we can. 150 is certainly better than 100. 165 would be closer to the amount which would be a round number, closer to the amount where the amount at $166.66 becomes equal to a $500 donation. I probably haven't explained that well, but it's just been a lot of time.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Why don't we go through public comment, and then if there, please hold additional questions for particular commenters till the end of public comment.
All right, fair enough.
Thank you for your time.
Good day, Commissioners. Thank you for entertaining all this and for your dedication to changing democracy. So, Common Cause, I'm Helen Grieco. I'm the Northern California organizer. I sent an email to all of you this morning, and I just wanted to reiterate a few points. First of all, Common Cause has been supporting public financing since our inception. It's one of the founding principles of why we created the Citizens Lobby Common Cause in 1970. We did work to help institute the San Francisco's public financing system, and we're here again today to be a voice of reason, we hope. So of the proposed changes, we support the maximum amount of public financing a candidate can receive. This is in your email, so I won't go through all the details. The spending limit for public finance candidates, the match of the public fund systems for 6-to-1, and the initial grant to be raised as well. As we've been speaking here today, there are 2 points that do not have disagreement, and we would like to leave this to the wisdom of the commissioners for you to sort this out with your staff and public comment, but I will make these 2 points. Philosophically, small donors is the foundation of why we even want a public financing system. So erring on the side of smaller contributions has always been philosophically the point of the system. And Emily's list, and I come from the feminist movement myself, other work that I've done, early money is like yeast. It does help money rise. So once again, while you can discuss whether it's 142 or 282, I think And whether you do it now because you think there's been enough changes or you should do it later, we feel it's important to take a good look at what is the right start date to get this money and how will it make it competitive. And yes, I guess you can compare to other systems, but once again, San Francisco can institute its own program because it's a very special city, county. It's an anomaly, frankly, but a good one. I lived here for 17 years, and I love the city. So thank you for all your work, and Common Cause continues to support moving forward on public financing to expand the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Don Eichelberger. Appreciate the opportunity to come speak to you today. I want to full-heartedly support this resolution. Everything in it should be approved. Since the gut shot to American democracy by Citizens United, looking for ways to more efficiently use our public funding is crucial, and I'm glad to see San Francisco setting a good example once again on that. That said, nothing I say from now on speaks against the resolution, but I look forward to the day when we can downplay the importance of a candidate's ability to raise funds. As long as candidates are made to raise money, that opens up all kinds of doors for, who they're getting the money from and everything like that. Even with public, somebody might not have the wherewithal to raise $500 a shot. Somebody might only want to work, get $25 a shot. So that's the one thing. My hope would be to see a way that the ability to operate a budget, to live within a budget, is more accented. If it were me, I would say, there's a goal line, here's the money, you've got this amount of money and this amount of time to get elected. No fundraising, no more, because, if you're working on a budget and you have to make decisions about how to spend the money in that, if you're used to fundraising, you might say, well, let's just raise taxes again, And that shouldn't be done. I think we need to have responsibility in the offices, not somebody that's shown to be a really good fundraiser, but somebody that knows how to live within a budget, can make hard decisions about where money gets spent and all that stuff. But that's just my opinion right now. I want to speak totally in support of the resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Cristina Fletes. I'm a voting rights attorney at the ACLU Foundation of Northern California, based here in San Francisco. I'm here in strong support of the recommendations and ask that you please vote in favor of the proposed ordinance. Over the last couple years, the ACLU Foundation of Northern California has been engaging different Bay Area organizations focused on organizing and building power among historically marginalized community and exploring publicly financed elections as an option to help address political inequality. We believe that small donor public financing, such as this proposal, a 6-to-1 matching system, is a critical tool to empower politically underrepresented communities. We applaud the Commission and local advocates' efforts to carefully craft a proposal that will work for San Francisco and be effective in ensuring the participation and competitiveness of community-based candidates who would otherwise not have a viable opportunity. We urge you to support this important reform. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Nancy Tung. I have been for the last 18 years, a public prosecutor, 11 of those years in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. I come to you as a private citizen. I am off work at this point. As a first-time candidate for the District Attorney's Office, one of the first things that people said to me when I thought about running for office was that money equals viability. And it wasn't experience, it wasn't knowledge of the issues, it wasn't ties to the community, but money. And I think San Francisco has done a very good job at trying to mitigate the forces of money in terms of what it does to our political system. But as you know, with the corrupting influence of special interests, PACs, independent expenditures, the ability of people who are non-traditional candidates and people of color has been diminished in our political system. So I know that these reforms will not affect my race, but I encourage the Commission to support these reforms by increasing the maximum amount of public financing, increasing the spending limit, increasing the match of public financing funds, and increasing the initial grant given to candidates. Because when we can start to change the dialogue, when we can start to give opportunities to people who would not otherwise be part of an entrenched political machine or have access to wealthy donors or a number of people who would support them, but people who are really from the community and people who know the issues and who would speak for people who are disenfranchised, we will begin to really support our democracy in a way that I think the founders envisioned. And expanding public financing will increase greater representation for all people in San Francisco. So I encourage you to adopt these reforms and consider also expanding these reforms to other citywide races such as the District Attorney's Office in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Chu and honorable commissioners. My name is Edward Wright. I'm a legislative aide in the District 4 office, and I'm here speaking on behalf of Supervisor Gordon Marr. Yesterday, we sent over a letter from Supervisor Marr detailing his strong support for the proposed ordinance alongside his recommendation for 2 amendments to it. I will speak towards those specific amendments in a moment, but first I just want to acknowledge that this has been a very long process. It has been also a very collaborative process. And I think the process that's led us to this point and to these recommendations being considered by this body speak very much to the principles that these reforms seek to enact and expand on. And I just want to express my gratitude to the staff and to the commission and to all the community advocates that have worked collaboratively to get us to this point. I think we should be proud of the process that led us here. In addition to that, the 2 things I wanted to touch on have been already addressed, but the first is recommendation number 1 and the amount of a particular contribution that should be matched. As you know, our office originally proposed matching up to $200 of a contribution, and the staff then recommended $100. The commission directed the staff to look further at $150. I do think it's important to consider what kind of policy rationales can inform the exact number that we land on, understanding that I think we all kind of share the same goal of trying to further amplify the role of smaller donations and incentivize candidates to reach out to those folks. For us at this point, it's thinking about these reforms in such a way that we don't think a goal of these reforms should be to decrease the value of a matched contribution under public financing. Understanding that the public financing program is not the totality of the funds that impact an election, and in certain races, not even the majority of the funds that impact an election when we consider the role that independent expenditure committees play. So we would advocate for matching up to 165 of a contribution. As Mr. Hill referenced, to maintain the current value of a maximum contribution, we would need to match up to 166.66. 165 gets us pretty close while being a little bit rounder of a number. And then on the other point for the initial grant distribution date, I also just want to highlight a policy consideration, which is we feel strongly that we need to align the filing deadline for a race with the date at which candidates in that race can begin to receive public money, understanding that the considerations that play into a candidate's decision to stay in a race and how funding can have an impact on that. And also we think it's in the public's interest to not have public money impacting a race until the field has been set. And once again, just thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pedro Hernandez. I'm the Senior Policy Coordinator of Fair Vote California. I'm here today to offer comments and feedback on the Ethics Commission's proposed plan. We're generally supportive of the plan. A little bit about Fair Vote. We believe that a healthy and long-lasting democracy relies on every citizen having a right to a vote that can truly contribute to meaningful representation. One of our platform issues is ranked choice voting. We've done a lot of education to the community and to candidates around the reform. As you are aware, under ranked choice voting, it eliminates the need to have a second runoff election, which is often seen as a barrier for a lot of candidates. San Francisco has removed that barrier. Since then, we've seen a lot more women and women of color run and win under ranked choice voting in the Bay Area, so we're really proud of that. Fair Vote supports passing a bulk of the reforms here. However, we wish to highlight one area of the Commission's plan that causes us concern, namely the proposed change to the initial grant for public funds. So according to the report, the staff recommends the 284th day. Currently, San Francisco has one of the earliest grant dates, which is nearly twice as early as other cities. Further, Seattle recently delayed its disbursement date by 35 days because voters found it was too early and they were losing their vouchers. That said, we'll add that the Seattle date in the table notes the general election date. All the other cities in that chart note the primary date, except for San Francisco, so that's something that I think could be reflected and something that should be considered during a change to the disbursement of funds. That said, because this initial grant date was already moved from February to June in the 2011-2012 ethics era, we don't want a repeat of the past where we had to reduce our match ratio and change around things again because of public outcry. So we think that these set of reforms are going to be really impactful. We should wait and see how these reforms play out and then consider changing the date at a later time when we've had the ability and the staff has had the bandwidth to look at how these things can work in tandem and in conjunction with each other. We seriously admire the Commission and the staff's seriousness by which they've approached a lot of these reforms. So we really are hoping to see a package come out of here without the initial disbursement date, consideration of elevating the 150 to 165 as mentioned, and the bulk of the reforms out of here, and let's get this thing passed and fix democracy here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Vivian Imperiali. I have been a campaign worker since 1985. I carefully choose my candidates for what they can bring to our city in terms of values, determination, organization, and insight. And then their chances of getting elected are threatened when their opponents amass huge war chests to be used to slam us. These donations not only are designed to affect the outcome of the election, but are designed to exert undue influence on the policies of our opponents. A striking example was Mayor Breed, who in obvious deference to her donors, who would be taxed under Proposition C, did not support the strong source of revenue that was the antithesis of what her donors wanted. Yet then she turned around and said her priority was homeless services and lamented that we need money for that. Donations have a loud voice and can shout down candidates who have the moral integrity to refuse to do the same in return. We need your support for the package of public finance and campaign reform to give admirable candidates a fighting chance to run successful campaigns against moneyed interests seeking control of elections and elected officials.
Thank you.
Hi, and thank you. I'm a small donor, resident of San Francisco in the District 4. And I urge you to pass these reforms with the amendments as proposed. These are dark times for democracy. In the past, even the most recent elections that many of us were involved in, and I'm giving my $25 here and my $50 there, dark money came in and just blew it out of the water. So we need to get these reforms happening to strengthen our democracy and have San Francisco be in the forefront of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Esther Marks, speaking as an individual. And so I'll make it brief. I think everyone is in agreement that it's very, that the public finance program involves public funds, and so there is a trust in allocation of, or how that money is used. So I didn't know about the change in 2012, that where prior to 2012, it was, the initial grant was awarded 284 days before the election, and it was Steve Hill's analysis that brought it to my attention. And so in my mind, though, what's absolutely critical is the information that when we did have the 284 days initial grant date before the election, 27.8% of the candidates who received public funds only got less than 5% of the votes. I mean, that's like, the people should not have run. But so to me, it was not a good use of public dollars. Now looking at after 2012, though, where it's 142 days, which is what it is currently, only 2.4% of the public campaign finance recipients had, a voting record of less than 5%. So in my mind, that is a better use of the public dollars. And just as, we talked about when the, who qualifies for public finance program, you want them to meet a certain contribution criteria, certain number of San Francisco supporters before they're considered legitimate candidates. Also in another section, you're pointing out that for incumbents who are basically running unopposed, we don't allocate any we don't have them allow them to participate in public finance program for good reason. Again, we want to use the funds wisely. So I'm totally at this point against having the initial grant awarded 284 days before the election. Just because, from history, it has shown that you're going to get candidates who really have no business running for public office.
Thank you.
Commissioners Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. On a number of previous occasions, I've referred to the activities of this commission as, quote, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, end quote. After more than a decade of observing this commission and its activities, all I have seen is a never-ending process of simply rewriting and rewriting again and again campaign finance laws. Again, quoting former Commissioner Kopp, quote, I don't think anyone is afraid of the Ethics Commission who is in competitive political life in San Francisco. The lobbyists have acclimated themselves to it over a period of 25 years, and so have the candidates. The talking about the small candidate campaign funds is all well and good, except for the fact that you have no power at all to control the ethics of the election process itself. All you have to do is look at how this commission dealt with former Supervisor Mark Farrell. That was the biggest circus I've ever seen. And this is how all the big candidates, all the incumbents are dealt with. They can pull money in the dark web, off the dark web, or from campaign finances, and you have absolutely no power to stop them. Number one, the only thing that this commission can do is if you find somebody violated it, you can ask the body that they belong to punish them, which they don't. The only thing you've ever done one time on the Sunshine Ordinance is the commission sent a recommendation to Mayor Lee that he remove former Library Commission President Jewel Gomez because of her public dealings with the public, and the mayor just ignored it. And I'll be honest with you, I think any recommendations you make to the Board of Supervisors, they will look at. If it doesn't appeal to them or meet their interests, they will eviscerate it and send it back to you. I've been coming here for a dozen years now, and it seems like you're always rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting the law and failing to take into account the people who these laws affect are A, the people who have the power to decide whether or not it will go into become a law, and B, They're the people who appoint you. It's the same reason you don't enforce the Sunshine Ordinance. All the people on my 36 orders of determination are the people who appoint you to the chairs you're sitting in. And you don't bite the hand that feeds you. So sitting around and I don't know what, playing around with public finance really doesn't do anything until you get to the point where you have the ability to do anything to make our elections actually fair.
Thank you. Any other public comment on agenda item number 4? No. Okay. So then I would propose a motion, if you turn to page 14, to as follows, to approve the recommendations set forth, 1A, to provide public financing for the first $150 matched at a 6-to-1 ratio, to increase the initial grant to $60,000 for supervisorial races and $300,000 for mayoral races, to increase the maximum funding a candidate can receive in a supervisorial race for $255,000, non-incumbent $252,000 for an incumbent, and B, for candidates for mayor, $1.2 million if a non-incumbent, and $1.185 million as an incumbent. Item 4, increase the initial IECs to $350,000 for supervisorial races and $1.7 million in mayoral races. And item number 5, allow initial grants to be distributed on the 142nd day. So retain that. There would be no change to the current law. Number 6, align the qualification fundraising period for supervisorial candidates with that of mayoral candidates by including the 70th day before the election. And 7, require that supervisorial candidates file threshold reports upon raising or spending $10,000. And then I would add an 8th item to the motion would be to add an operative date of January 1st, 2020. So just, Deputy City Attorney Chen, so for the motion, there was a recommendation on item 5 that was to change the 142nd day to the 284th day, but I'm choosing not to adopt that recommendation, but to retain the 142nd day, so we wouldn't have to include that in the motion. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so I would amend my prior motion to delete item 5.
Right, not to make that change.
Yeah, is that the motion clear for record minute keeping purposes and then also for commissioners?
Yeah, I think we understand the motion. I think it's good for the record, and so I think we need a second.
As amended, in other words, deleting suggestion 5, I second the motion as to the amended version.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, second.
I have just one
Yes.
question before we vote, and this doesn't have to be answered right now, but that the board's legislative analysts report not coming to the same conclusions that your analysis. I don't know if they also used the higher match, since that wasn't the law, but that's a fairly dramatic distinction between our saying in practice the real candidates would have had to come up with slightly fewer contributions as opposed to considerably more. So if you can just follow up on that just for our education and as we track these changes going forward and how they're being realized in the world, I would like to have that reconciled and find out what the impact really is, because I do agree. I think it's important to encourage small donors to get involved, but I also think it's important to not have people spending all their time talking about how much money they need to raise as opposed to what they're going to do once they get here. So, all right, thanks. I'm sorry, there's I'll be happy to ask you a question if you have an answer to that. Supervisor Morris, Mr. Wright.
Yeah, just to speak on that briefly, I believe the BLA report, which to clarify is still a draft report, it has not been issued, did use a different methodology. It was looking at an increased matching rate, but it was looking at averages for contributions as opposed to maximum contributions. It is our intention to have that report issued prior to this package, this draft ordinance being considered by the Board of Supervisors, if in your wisdom you decide to approve it today.
All right, and then in that case, I would ask you if you could put Mr. Ford in touch with the budget analyst person on this so that we don't just add confusion when this same set goes over to the board. That would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to meet with you, Pat, and perhaps with the BLA as well before we
Yeah, and Mr. Wright, if possible, if the final report could be shared with us, that would be very helpful as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Commissioner Lee, did you have other questions?
I do agree that this is a really good piece of proposal that needs to be supported. I don't want to hold, this up, but at the same time, I do want to reemphasize the whole idea of public financing is to really bring in the disenfranchised to make sure that their voice will be heard and their participation would be included. And I continue to struggle with the 100 versus 150. Again, I'm not going to hold this vote up. I was just reminded a couple of weeks ago by a couple of neighbors that 30% of San Francisco's population are older persons who live on fixed income. Yet, majority of them consistently involve themselves in the electoral process, whether it's voters, campaign volunteers, campaign donors. They're the ones who are probably included in Mr. Ford's report that, many grassroots community-based candidates, they receive small donations under $100, and I have a feeling those are the people who are included in your assessment. Much has been said about the Seattle voucher system, but I think a central point that my Seattle friends had consistently want me to remember is the whole idea of the Seattle program is to make sure that the power, the political power, is returned to the residents. Therefore, the vouchers are on their hands that they can determine the future of the city. Those vouchers are not that much expensive. They're in increment like $25 or what have you. But because of that change, it's changed the whole concept of how candidates run the campaign, how voters' voices are being considered and respected. Candidates now have to earn those $25 or $100. So I have, I understand it's really tough to run campaigns. I've seen first-time candidates, standing on street corners, trying to let people know who they are. And that's why we have public financing, to support folks like that who is truly from the community, who could truly represent the community's voices. So I still believe the $100 donation is not just a matter of process, it's a matter of the people who are writing those checks, whether they should be and could be and must be included when the candidates talk about policies and talk about their platform. So, again, the two things is the public finance system is supposed to support the residents who's been marginalized, who's been invisible. It's also to support candidates who do not come in with, huge support base. But, I understand the need to move forward, and I hope that once we, put the new system in place, that we can revisit this, and hopefully by then we would have more numbers, and by then, we may see a new budget on campaign financing, and hopefully we can revisit the $100 one, because I really feel that that population really needs to be, their voice really needs to be respected and honored.
Very well said. Thank you, Commissioner Lee. So we have an amended motion that was seconded by Commissioner Lee and Deputy City Attorney Shen. Should we do a voice vote with the Executive Director, or would that be the best process?
I think just for the minutes, it was seconded by me.
Yeah, it was seconded by Commissioner Lee.
You said Lee.
I'm sorry.
It's up to you. We can do a voice vote or we can do a roll call. It's up to you. Just a brief process reminder, we will need a unanimous vote on the set of amendments today.
Sorry, I
Moving
need to
forward.
correct. It was the amended motion was seconded by Commissioner Smith. Yeah, yes. So, Director Pelham, could you do a roll call vote, please, on the motion?
On the motion,
Amended motion.
on the amended motion as proposed by Commission Chair Chu and seconded by Commissioner Smith. Commissioner Smith?
Yes.
Commissioner Smith, aye.
Aye.
Commissioner Lee?
Aye.
Commissioner Lee votes aye. Commissioner Ambrose?
Aye.
Commissioner Ambrose votes aye, and Chair Chu?
Aye.
Chair Chu votes aye. The ayes have it with 4-0, unanimous vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'd like to echo Mr. Ford's comments and also Mr. Wright's. I think this has been a long process, but I think a very worthwhile one, and it's been a privilege to be a part of it. And I appreciate the dialogue, the partnership, the collaboration, and look forward to more great work like this in the future. So now I would like to direct staff to prepare this and into the appropriate format to be able to send over to the Board of Supervisors. And then maybe you can update us at the next meeting on where we stand with all that and how things are going. Thank you. Okay. Well, let's see. Agenda item number 5, discussion and possible action on proposed amendments to regulations related to Article 1, Chapter 1, and Article 3, Chapters 2 and 6 of the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code. It's really cold in here.
I know.
Thank you, Chair Chu, Commissioners. Item 5 is a set of amendments to 3 articles of regulations, or I should say regulations supporting 3 articles of our code. Specifically, those are the Campaign Finance Reform Ordinance, which is Article 1, Chapter 1 of the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code, Article 3, Chapter 2, which is known as the Government Ethics Ordinance, is all the conflict of interest, substantive conflict of interest rules, and also Article 3, Chapter 6, which are the code sections regarding behested payment reporting. So this set of regulations is in all 3 of those buckets. As you remember from last month, we brought these amendments to you to achieve 3 different purposes. One is to implement help implement the new code sections that were created by the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Ordinance. Those are in effect now, and some of the regulations here will help to clarify the requirements and how regulated individuals are to comply with them. Additionally, these regulation amendments would help to provide clarification about code sections in the Campaign Finance Reform Ordinance that are separate from the ACAO. Pre-existing provisions of law about which staff might have given advice in the past, and the regulations can now serve to codify that advice and give better clarification to folks. And then lastly, a lot of these amendments are in the form of cleanup. They are changes that were not previously caught, and as we've discussed at prior meetings, we now have processes in place to make sure this doesn't happen. Case in point, we're doing these sets of regulations right now to implement the ACAO. So we are confident that that will not happen in the future. But in any event, these regulations will help to change parts that were not changed in the past when the code diverged from the regs. So that's the purpose of these. I'd like to give you a little bit of an update from last month when these were before you. Since then, we did notice these regs publicly on May 16th. Under the charter, there has to be a public notice given at least 10 days in advance of a meeting in which regulations will be voted on. At the last meeting, we had not done that notice because the regs were just offered for discussion purposes and to generate public comment. But at this meeting, we did do that notice, so you are able to vote on the regulation amendments today if you so choose. Also, after we had these regs at the last meeting, we got public comment from a number of folks, and that helped inform the set that's before you today, which is by and large quite similar to the set from April, but does reflect a number of comments that we received. And I'd like to thank those who were involved. We got a lot of very helpful comments that I think make this a stronger set of amendments. Some of those comments we got before the 10-day notice went out, so we were able to incorporate those changes into the version that's before you today as agenda item 5. That is identical to what we sent out with the public notice on the 16th. However, we got some public comments after that notice had gone out. And because of that, there's a set of, I guess you'd call them supplemental amendments. It's a one-page sheet that you each received, yes. It's also on the public table that's titled Agenda Item 5, Staff's Proposed Amendments Based on Public Comment.
Okay, it was handed to us.
Do each of the commissioners have that sheet?
Looking for it.
We might need one.
Do I have this?
Easier.
Okay.
I've got it. I have it already, yeah.
Great, so again, these are changes that staff is proposing that these be amended into this larger set. These were comments we were not able to get into the draft because we had to send out that 10-day notice.
So just to recap, then these additional 1.5 pages would be incorporated into what the regular agenda item?
Correct, yes. I would propose that those be amended into this larger set to be one set. And since they are in written form and are available to the public, Mr. Shen's confirmed that process-wise is okay for you to approve those.
Yeah, so we can then, if we were to approve these today, would move to approve what you have attached and add this. Okay.
Correct.
And that's okay from a process standpoint.
And just to make things even a little bit more complicated for you, there are also 2 additional public comments that we received that are not reflected in this extra set that we think it is important to include in this list. So I'd like to show you where those are right now. The first one is on page 21. And that's the stamp at the bottom that says Agenda Item 5, page 21. I know there are 2 page numbers on a lot of these pages.
So
the one at the bottom center.
It says page 13 on the
Exactly.
lower right corner? Okay.
Exactly. And this is Regulation 1.126-7, Contributor Information. The change that was pointed out to us is that in the first line, it says, the first line of the underlined text, this is new text. Well, it's not new, but it's being changed to match what the ACAO now says. I am not a city contractor or a director, officer, 10% shareholder. What should be there instead of 10% shareholder is greater than 10% owner. Because the code actually does not cover 10% owners. It only covers those who own more than 10%.
So the language you're proposing is to add greater than 10%, and then just greater than, and then keep 10% shareholder?
I would.
Or greater than, what's the language that should be in the in the clause between officer and then, or subcontractor?
Greater than 10% owner.
Owner, not shareholder.
Shareholder is what was in previously, but owner would match the code more closely. So.
Okay.
I
So
would-
this is a conforming change to the code?
Correct. Okay. Correct. That the code technically would not cover someone who owns 10% in a contracting entity. You have to own more than 10%. So that was pointed out to us, and that is correct. So I think it's important that change be included.
Okay, so the change should read, then that language should read greater than 10% owner.
Correct. The second change that I would propose is on page 24. And this is language from Regulation 1.142-5. In A, and this pertains to the statement of participation or non-participation that candidates file to state whether or not they will participate in the public financing program. This regulation incorrectly states the deadline for filing nomination papers. It states that that deadline is the 88th day prior to the election, but as we actually discussed during the previous agenda item, it's the 142nd day. So the change that Mr. Shen pointed out is that if the language starting on the third full sentence, which is on the third line, that says, under state law, a candidate must file his or her nomination papers no later than the 88th day prior to the election. If that were struck, that would make the sentence a complete sentence, and it would make it accurate. So the sentence would only read, unless the deadline to file nomination paper is extended pursuant to California Elections Code 10220. Now, that doesn't make it a full sentence.
No, that's not a full
No.
sentence.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Yes. So it does work if you combine that with the immediately preceding sentence and join them with a comma. So the sentence would say, the candidate may not withdraw or amend his or her statement after the deadline for filing nomination papers, comma, unless the deadline to file nomination papers is extended pursuant to California Elections Code.
Okay, so you're deleting the clause, under state law, a candidate must file his or her nomination papers no later than the 88th days prior to the election.
Yes.
Deleting that, okay.
Yeah, because for the candidates who can participate in public financing, mayoral and supervisorial candidates, they have a different deadline than other candidates. Some candidates actually have an 88th day prior to the election deadline, but it's not the same across all races. So this regulation didn't capture that difference. So this would be in the cleanup category.
Okay.
So apologies for the many sources of these amendments, that they're not all in one place.
I'm sorry, I hate to do this, but can you read that sentence again? You must have struck something else, because it, okay, all of that comes out. Thank you. Got it. Thanks.
Any other changes?
No, that's all. The final thing that I did want to note, there were a lot of public comments that we incorporated. We thought a lot of them, including these, were they made a lot of sense and they improved the regulations. There were a couple, though, that we declined to incorporate into these, so I wanted to highlight those for your information. One of the comments that we heard was that the regulations should not state that candidates must file specific and distinct forms in order to comply with some of the new disclosure requirements that were created by the ACAO. So specifically, the regulations say that in order to comply with section 1.114.5, 1.124, and 1.125, I'll explain what those are, that the candidates must file form 1.114.5, 125, and 124. So basically, each of those disclosure requirements, staff would create a new form that the candidate, or I shouldn't say candidate, filer, because sometimes they're not candidates, that the filer would file in order to comply with the filing requirement. What these filing requirements are, disclosure requirements, 1.114.5 says that when a committee receives a contribution of a certain amount that was made at the behest of an elected official, they have to disclose that that contribution was behested by the official. And 1.124 says that when a committee receives contribution of a certain amount from a business entity, they have to state at least one principal officer of the business entity and whether or not the entity has received a grant or contract recently from the city. 1.125 is the bundling disclosure. It says that when a candidate-controlled committee receives a certain number of contributions that were delivered or transmitted by someone other than the contributor, they have to disclose the identity of that bundler and list all of the contributions that were bundled by that person. In implementing these new disclosure requirements, staff is creating new forms for each of the disclosure requirements so that filers will have a specific process for complying with these that are tailored to the disclosure requirements themselves. There will be a field for each of the separate items that are part of the disclosure requirement, and those forms will feed into our pre-existing electronic disclosure system where filers file, and then since it's an electronic format, each of the pieces of data separately goes into a different column or row in a spreadsheet, so that if you're doing research, you can electronically search through all of the disclosures. You can search for who's bundled for a certain candidate, or which elected officials have behested contributions to ballot measure committees, those kinds of things you can actually research. That's why it's important for them to be done on forms, distinct forms. The comment that we received was that we should not create distinct forms because that would constitute a significant administrative burden on the filers, that it would be more reasonable if they were able to satisfy these new disclosure requirements by stating this required information on the public note on the Form 460. So the Form 460 is the campaign statement that all committees file semi-annually, sometimes also shortly before elections, to basically disclose all of their finances, incoming, outgoing cash, loans, non-monetary contributions, everything goes on the 460. There is a way to include a public note, which is basically a box where you can insert text, and that's used usually to clarify something about the filing or provide some information that you couldn't neatly put under one of the pre-created fields. So the public comment was around the idea that that public note box could be used to note these new disclosure requirements. And we opted not to pursue that course because, for one, it would be hard for filers. It's a single box, it's unstructured, it's hard to know how to properly fill this information in. And then likewise for people who want to look at this information, it's not intuitive to look at the public note. You would have to know that's where it is in order to look there. There'd be no other place to tell you to look there. And then also there'd be no way to actually search it. Since it would be unstructured data, you wouldn't be able to perform the kind of detailed searches that people usually do when they're looking at this kind of information.
Through the chair, can I ask, one of the commenters had asked that we post forms on our website so that people can preview them before you actually are up to the speed of logging into the system. Is that something that we already have or can do easily? Because just from a background point of view, maybe, or is it part of your, I know you're doing training and outreach because of all the changes, et cetera. Maybe that's just something that needs to be, made widely available so that they know what to do with it when they do get the new form.
Yeah, I think that's something that we could do. That is not our current practice. I don't know if Director Pelham wants to speak to that point. But currently, we don't provide those forms specifically so that people use the electronic filing system.
I don't mean provide them, but you can make a PDF viewable, right, on the website or, in the...
I think the concern is that people would then use the PDF to file, that they enter the information into the PDF and email it to us, which that's the old format. That's how filings used to be done, is that people would fill them out essentially basically like a electronic version of a paper form.
And then PDFs are not searchable.
It's not searchable. It doesn't feed into our system.
Oh, no, I understand why you don't want to do that. I mean, you can put a watermark or something on it so that it wouldn't work. I'm just saying, I thought, I understand because there are some of us who don't live in the electronic world, weren't born and raised in it, and like to see things, sort of like, how does this whole form play out without clicking through 10 screens, or whatever. I think that there's some, public information request there that was sincere. So I don't definitely want to let people lapse back into unnecessary waste of paper, but just didn't realize that was the concern about keeping the forms only electronic.
I think Commissioner Ambrose, you raised a really important point, is like what's the interface and how user-friendly is the process. And I think that it's important that we strive to improve the interactions. And I think there's a lot of value to making it available, at least visibly, if not, downloadable PDF, but it would leave it to you, Director Pelham, and Gayatri to determine how best to do that. But if this, and would love to hear from in public comment if this would be helpful, to people because I know for one, it's nice to be able to actually see something and check it out before actually committing to logging in
and I think her
filing.
Request was limited to those particular new forms as it relates to obligations of nonprofit or what she considered to be people outside the general electoral process where they might be a little bit more intimidated by NetFile or something. Anyway, just if you can look into that.
If I might, just a quick response. Under the Executive Director's Report, we have some updates, and our Deputy Director and Chief Programs Officer, Gayatri Taikandil, is here, and I think she can speak to the process that we're engaging in to get information out there online and in the easiest way possible. So maybe I'll just defer that, and we can ask her to talk a little bit more about what's going on currently.
Thanks.
That would be great.
And I had one more question. I know you were giving us the things you put in and the things you didn't put in, the comments presented by Ms. Stern. Kind of the bigger one is this whole definition of affiliate. So are you going to speak to that, or are we going to hear about it on the public comment?
Yes, I will speak to that one.
Okay.
But before we leave the separate forms issue, a couple of my fellow commissioners weren't on the commission at the time, and Commissioner Lee, perhaps you remember, I think the discussion at the time was disclosure versus a ban on behested payments entirely, and that it seems to me that when we went down the path of going with disclosure of behested payments instead of simply banning them, that the disclosure would serve as the transparency that would be beneficial to understand the flow of behested payments. So I think that creating a separate form both for the bundling and the behested payments would serve that purpose, and because in the absence of a searchable database, it would be extremely difficult, if not practically impossible, to determine whether and how much money has been flowing at the behest of elected officials. So that's just my 2 cents from the trenches. Okay.
So another public comment that we received that we did not incorporate was to create safe harbor provisions for 2 of these very disclosure requirements. We did opt to create a safe harbor provision for one of them. So the one that we did recommend creating safe harbor for is the disclosure of what you could call political behests. I think that's what they were called during the ACAO review period, and this is 1.114.5 when a committee is receiving a political contribution at the behest of an elected official. The reason that we felt safe creating a safe harbor, and basically what the safe harbor says is that if the committee is not informed by the contributor that the contribution was made at the behest of an elected official, then the committee will not be held liable for failing to disclose that, because there's no way for them to know. The reason why we felt like that warranted safe harbor is twofold. The main reason is that there's a statutory requirement in that code section that the contributor inform the committee that the contribution was made at the behest of an elected official. That means that from an enforcement perspective, if the committee fails to disclose a political behest, we pursue an enforcement action against them. They claim that they never received notice from the contributor. That means that we could then turn to the contributor in that enforcement action, and they would be liable, potentially subject to penalties, unless they could prove that they, in fact, had given that notice to the committee. So essentially, it wouldn't create a kind of workaround to the disclosure requirement, that if the committee tried to use this safe harbor, there would still be liability if somebody actually failed to give the notice. The other reason that we felt safe harbor was a little bit more warranted here was that there's no way to see on the face of the contribution that it even triggers disclosure. All you would see is a $5,000 contribution from somebody. Nothing on the face of that indicates that it warrants disclosure. It's different for the bundling disclosure and the entity disclosure. For both of those, when you receive the contribution, the trigger for the disclosure is apparent to you. When you receive a check from a corporation, you can see that it's a check from a corporation. Whether or not you have educated yourself about disclosure requirements to know that that is disclosable is separate, but I'm just talking about, is it possible for you, just when you receive the contribution, to have the knowledge that the trigger is present? And the answer is yes. You can see that it's an entity contribution. So it makes it a little bit less necessary for a safe harbor to exist. Likewise with bundling. When a candidate committee receives an envelope of 10 checks that's handed to them by one person, they know that bundling has just occurred. There's no separate inquiry for them to ask whether or not bundling has occurred. Again, I understand that they might not appreciate that bundling disclosures exist. That's more of an engagement and compliance endeavor. We are seeking to educate committees to make sure that they are aware that the disclosure requirement exists. But they at least know when they are getting bundled checks. And they need to implement some strategy within their organization that when bundling happens, that it's labeled as such, so that the treasurer or whoever else is filing disclosure can have that information and can file the form correctly.
Can I ask a real basic question? Is bundling only when you get the checks in one envelope or for one person? So if somebody has a fundraiser and they encourage everybody in the room to make a donation, but they give them all separate envelopes and stamps, then they didn't bundle. But if they take them in hand and bring them all in at the same time, they bundled?
So the language in the statute is deliver or transmit.
Deliver or transmit.
Deliver or
Okay.
transmit.
So not encourage or, okay.
Correct. That would be more of a behest if I encourage you to contribute to a candidate. But if
Right.
I actually
But
physically
if you're not an elected official, you can behest all you want. That's just public advocacy, right?
Correct, and it's not disclosable.
Right, okay.
Correct.
All right, thanks. Sorry,
So-
I'm still learning.
No, it's a good
the
question.
lingo.
We are in the process now of beginning to give advice and interpret what the language means, but we do consider delivering and transmitting to have a physical component to it.
Right. And actually, that's one of my big picture questions too. I mean, this law went in effect in January, so you have been engaged somewhat with answering questions about this. Have there been much in the way of questions, given that we haven't had an election since January?
No, not much.
Okay.
Not much.
But if I may add,
Yes,
there hasn't been
Commissioner.
much, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't think there was much public awareness campaign going on, right? Other than the folks who are intimately involved with public financing. So the general public really hasn't been aware of this law going into effect a few months ago, right?
Yes, so our engagement and compliance team is currently working on developing the kind of materials that Ms. Lerman spoke about in her public comment. They're working on the kind of fact sheets and website content that will help people understand that. And they're in the process of thinking about what kind of communications will be most effective to notify people about these. And as they develop the forms too, there will be content at the top of the form that will give some explanation that would appear kind of on the website when you're going to fill out an electronic form. So yes, that's definitely a big priority right now. So the last item that Commissioner Ambrose alluded to earlier is the definition of affiliate. In the regulation, we propose that sponsored or controlled committees be retained in that definition. What that means is that if a corporation, let's say, has a contract with the city and that an official recently approved that contract such that the contribution ban is triggered and the corporation already cannot give to the candidate, but now under 1.126, the principal officers, shareholders of more than 10%, and subcontractors would be prohibited from giving to that official who just approved the contract. And additionally, we think that it's important to maintain the rule that additionally any sponsored or controlled committee would be prohibited from giving. So in other words, if the contractor is IBM and then IBM sponsors IBM PAC, that IBM PAC should also be prohibited from giving to the candidate if IBM itself is prohibited. This was explicit in the code before the ACAO. The code before the ACAO used a different set of defined terms, and the ACAO kind of reshuffled the terms, but it did not include sponsored or controlled committee in the new definition. The public comment that we received said that that evidences a clear legislative intent to not cover sponsored or controlled committees. But staff takes a different view, that that was not something that was done intentionally for the purpose of exempting sponsored or controlled committees from the legislation, and that thus it is within the power of the commission to retain these entities under the ambit of 1.126. We also think that it's incredibly important that they be retained, only because how obvious it is that a business entity could work around 1.126 by merely having its sponsored or controlled committee make the contribution that would otherwise be prohibited. We think that would fly in the face of the clear intent of the provision and would frustrate it. It's also the case that sponsored or controlled committees would not be caught under general aggregation principles most of the time. So separate from 1.126, the contractor contribution ban, there are general principles of aggregation in the code that say in certain circumstances, we will aggregate the contributions of separate individuals or entities. We will count them together. And the nexus has to be, excuse me, that the one person or entity directs or controls the other entity, or sorry, directs and controls. So it's a much narrower nexus. You have to direct and control, and it has to be by the majority of the same people. So what that means is that if a corporation has a sponsored PAC but different people control the corporation and from the PAC. So let's say you have a board of directors that controls the corporation, but you have a political giving committee that controls the PAC, and those are different people, that the PAC's contributions would not necessarily be aggregated with the corporation's contributions. That means that if we do not consider sponsored or controlled committees to always be affiliates, there is the potential that they will not be aggregated under those general aggregation principles, and therefore corporations who are subject, or I shouldn't say corporations, any business entity that's subject to 1.126 could then use its sponsored or controlled committee to bypass 1.126. And that would be a new development in the law that does not exist or did not exist prior to the ACAO, and we think it's important to avoid that effect.
In the law, it says that sponsored and controlled is defined in Chapter 1 of the Campaign and Government Conduct Code. You don't happen to have that definition. I'm still having a little trouble understanding the difference between IBM's PAC and IBM's sponsored and controlled PAC and who that brings in. But I do hear you about, I think that the big concern about the question raised was what was the legislative intent, and that is something that you can ask the city attorney's office to take a position on if you so desire.
Sure. I can just briefly add that I agree with staff's interpretation.
All right.
This language, as expressed in the regulation, obviously the purpose of the ban is to prohibit contributions from certain companies doing business with the city. And to be frank, it would be a rather unreasonable interpretation to say that that does not extend to a campaign committee directly controlled by that same company or corporate entity. That would be a very unreasonable interpretation and a very unreasonable result, in my opinion.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Commissioner Ambrose, did you have other questions or any other commissioner questions? Any other questions? No. Okay. Pat, is there any other comments or?
Nope, those would be my comments on this.
Okay, thank you. I would like to invite public comment on agenda item number 5.
Well, this is about.
Could you pull the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is regulation listed on page 12. I think. Anyway, it's the provision of how long the executive director, how much time the executive director has to certify a candidate being eligible for public finance and for processing matching funds. The current and I didn't know there was such a thing between the regulations and code, so I had a hard time finding the code, and so your senior analyst sent that to me. But anyway, the current regulation and code is that the executive director for certifying a candidate who makes application for the public finance program has 30 days to make that determination. In the code, it also says in terms of the processing of matching funds, the executive director has 4 days to, for it to be processed. And I'm proposing that the days be shortened. As you've heard before, one of the biggest problems is not only a surety of receiving public funds, but the quickness with which, the funds are made available. And so I am proposing that for processing applications for or certification for public finance for candidates, that it be shortened to 10 working days. And then for processing matching applications, it be shortened to 3 days. Now, I know from my experience as a volunteer treasurer in 2016, I had no problems at all. And applications were processed very quickly. Now, 2018, it was a different matter, and I was told verbally that most certifications take place within a 2-week period. So I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for 10 days to be put in writing as a goal for processing the certification. And by the same token, I don't think it's a challenge for staff to process matched contributions to 3 days. And if there is a problem of timing in terms of the matching, the current regulation is that the minimum match or the minimum amount that has to be applied for the matching fund is $1,000. And so that could be increased so that, it would happen, the application would happen less frequently. There is also a requirement, though, that if the match is requested 10 days before the election, which I think should remain in place, that the minimum contribution match requested is $200. I think that should remain in place. So,
Thank you.
page 16 in the regulations.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Anita Mayo, Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, Pittman. I just have a few comments regarding the proposed regulations. On page 17, proposed regulation 1.126-1E clarifies the definition of affiliate, a new term added by the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Ordinance, ACAO, with respect to contractors doing business with the city. Under the proposed regulation, the term affiliate includes any committee that is sponsored or controlled by the named party or prospective named party to a city contract. This proposed definition, however, exceeds the scope of the ACAO. Under the previous version of Section 1.126 of CFRO and its regulations, the contractor contribution ban applied to a committee that was sponsored or controlled by the party or prospective named party to the contract. However, when the ACAO was adopted, a sponsored or controlled committee was deleted from the contractor ban provisions of CFRO and was not included as part of the definition of affiliate in the ACAO. As a result, the term affiliate does not include a committee that is sponsored or controlled by the named party or prospective named party to a contract. Accordingly, the corresponding language in this regulation should be deleted. The same principle that applies to the more than 10% provision that you just changed applies here. In addition, exempting a committee from the contractor ban is consistent with some provisions of state law. For example, California Government Code 15626 imposes limits on contributions from a party, participant, or an agent of the foregoing to a member of the State Board of Equalization during a specified time period before an adjudicatory proceeding involving that party or participant. However, the regulations specifically exempt from coverage contributions from committees affiliated with that party, participant, or agent of the foregoing. On page 20, proposed regulation 1.126-3C provides the notice requirement for city contractors, and one of the listed notices in subsection C refers to a committee that is sponsored or controlled by the contracting party. As I just mentioned, since the committee language was deleted from CFRO when the ACAO was adopted, the reference to committee in this regulation should be deleted. And finally, on page 21, the proposed regulation 1.126-7, you've just addressed my final comment by changing that language, 10% language, from 10% to more than 20%, which is specifically stated in the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Jesse Minardi. I'm a political law attorney practicing here in San Francisco, and I'm speaking today on my own behalf. I wanted to just indicate my general support for the proposed regulatory amendments and to commend and thank Pat Ford for all his hard work and for the open and thorough approach that he took with respect to these amendments. They've been needed for a little while now, and I think Mr. Ford did an excellent job with them generally. So I did want to address very briefly two areas where I think in general we may agree in principle, if not on the ultimate regulatory proposal in front of you. In particular, first, as Mr. Ford said, I think some of us would have preferred to be able to use the primary campaign report accessed by the general public, the Form 460, to disclose the new campaign-related information, not the behested payment information, but there's the bundlers, there's the money raised by elected officials, and then there's the corporate donor information. We would have preferred the 460 instead of the 3 new separate forms. But if that's not going to happen at this point, I guess I would just simply ask that the Commission commit to integrating the new reporting with the electronic filing requirement system, meaning NetFile, that's used with respect to the 460, as is sort of done with the public financing system. So that, and that is, not immediately, obviously, but I know that it's technically feasible. So just as soon as sort of feasibly possible, because in general, I think it's going to lead to more accurate reporting, and it's going to be easier for the committees that have to comply with this to track and to store and ultimately to report the data. So that's just the one comment. And then second, just want to explain with respect to the request for the safe harbor for one of the reporting requirements. As Mr. Ford said, there's already a safe harbor requirement with respect to the money raised by public officials. I'll finish up. Not asking with respect to bundling, because that's pretty apparent for the committee, but more with respect to the corporate donor disclosure, because with the information about a principal officer, like a CEO, I mean, that's something you can find online and something people, it's pretty easy to determine. But with respect to the question of whether somebody has received funds from the city in the prior 24 months, it's hard for a committee to verify that other than relying on the donor itself to provide that information. And so, all we can do is ask and follow up and say, are you sure? But ultimately, the information, if they give us information and say, hey, there's no contract, we have to rely on that. And I guess what we would say is that it's sort of, if a committee makes a reasonable, good faith attempt to get that information and reasonably relies, again, in good faith on the information that's provided to them by the donor, it would seem unfair ultimately to penalize that committee if the information given to them was inaccurate or incomplete. So those are my two comments, but in general, again, I just want to commend Mr. Ford for an excellent job in general on these regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Ford, just to follow up on Mr. Minority's point about the integration in NetFile, I would imagine, but I do want to confirm, that the new forms created would be integrated into NetFile so that, I mean, there would be no other way to file them other than through NetFile. Is that correct? Perhaps in the fullness of time they will be.
I'll ask our Deputy Director, Gayatri Takandil, to address that. I think there are some questions that might come up also during the Executive Director's report, but since the topic is on the table now, if I could ask Gayatri to maybe come and address that.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. For the new forms that we're building out for ACAO, they are being built in a different system, DocuSign system, and not NetFile, because DocuSign is a system that's available through city contract, and we wouldn't need additional funding for designing the system. versus in order to build these forms in NetFile, we will need funding and also contract in place to be able to do that. So we've been mostly building all of the new forms using DocuSign.
I see. So once the forms are submitted to the commission, though, in DocuSign, are they, they'll then be searchable by the public?
That is right. They will be searchable by the public because these forms, the DocuSign system is integrated with the open data system, city's open data system. So we're able to post the filings through data SF in real time, as and when we receive filings. Yeah.
I see. Okay, so but Form 460s are filed through NetFile? I see, and that, but
Yes.
in order to create NetFile filings, it would require budget that's, or dollars that are not currently in our budget.
That is correct, and we'll also need to work with NetFile to see if those types of enhancements can be made in their system. I know for some of the forms, the suggestion did come up regarding incorporating those data elements or fields within the 460, but we looked at the current form, and I don't think it provides an easy way to efficiently incorporate that level of detail into 460. So we're planning to talk to NetFile and see what it would take to enhance the system. And of course, we'll also need to look at funding in addition to that. So we can get back to you when we have more information from them. And I don't have an idea of the timeline because it will also require them to do an evaluation of the requirements and then get back to us. So
I see. Okay, so it's not as it seems like DocuSign is a more straightforward and
right.
Inexpensive, less expensive, and
right.
Less resource-intensive solution to the filing.
Yes, relative to the NetFile system. So for building out a DocuSign form, there is a lot of work involved in designing and coding, which our EDDA team, Steven's team, is working on actively. But we have a framework of how to build those forms because we have several forms already built out using DocuSign. And the form is end-to-end automated from the point when somebody files a form on our website to how it gets stored internally in our repository and how it gets posted onto the public. So we're able to reuse that framework for building out new forms.
Okay. The only thing I would ask is that even though there might be separate systems on the back end at the commission, but to the extent and as feasible from a design standpoint, from a user experience, if it could be invisible, so that as Mr. Mainardi and Ms. Mayo's clients go in to go file, that it wouldn't be, oh, where do I have to navigate now? Oh, I didn't know there was DocuSign. So that the user experience would be as seamless as possible, despite the fact that there are two different architectures in the back supporting it.
I think that's a great feedback. That's something we're certainly looking into. As we are building out these additional forms, we are also building out web content, as Pat Ford mentioned earlier. For each of these forms, we're building out separate web pages with instructions so that we can provide enough information to the public regarding these forms. We're also looking at the menu design and layout of our website. There may be places where we need to highlight certain forms, and we're also looking at how we can provide information about all of these forms in one place. So that's certainly something we're looking into as we are enhancing our...
That would be great. I was on the Los Angeles Ethics Commission site, and then, if you're a candidate, if you are, if you are a committee, so however you design it, I'm not trying to tell the painter how to paint, but as you think about these, the redesign of the website and moving things around, like I really want you to put the user experience, like for those who are wanting to know, well, what's a Form 460 to those who are very experienced participants in the political process, so that it's as little friction as possible.
Yes.
I think would be great.
And as you may know, commissioners, in December 2016, we did launch our new website. So a lot of our web content is already redesigned and more modernized than our previous website. But as we're building out these additional requirements, we are noticing that some changes are needed in how we are navigating to different types of information on our website. So that's something definitely on our radar. I can talk more about ACO implementation in the ED report section as well. Definitely want to give you an update on how we're approaching these types of activities right now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Comments or questions from commissioners? Commissioner Ambrose?
Questions. And it's great that you're doing all that work on outreach, because I know how complicated this is, and I'm sure if we want to encourage people to get involved in the political process, we're going to need to hold their hand to get them started. So the comment about safe harbor. So we're giving safe harbors on behested payments because it's not clear that the money was behested if it comes from someone, and that makes total sense to me. It looks to me, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, that on page 13 in the right-hand corner page number, that under 1.1267, we're also giving a sort of a, whatever, maybe a safe path by telling the candidate that if you get someone who gave you the money to sign this statement, then you can rely on that. Is that correct? So if the candidate will meet the due diligence requirement of the contribution ban in 1.126, if the contributor, whoever that happens to be, certifies that the following is true: I am not a city contractor, director, office greater than 10% owner. And that means then that we wouldn't find them to be in violation if they get one of these statements signed by everybody who gives them money. And then I have another question after that.
I would have to look at whether or not that would actually be a complete defense and result in no liability, or merely would be a mitigating factor. I don't know right now. Looking at it, I would have to look at the code and the other regs and see if satisfying due diligence is sufficient to have a complete defense.
Okay, I think that's important, because if we are having served as general counsel for the water, power, and sewer enterprise, we did thousands of contracts for over $100,000 over short periods of time with all the capital improvements. The number of subcontractors could be literally thousands of subcontractors who may or may not even know that the person that they gave their bid to actually submitted a proposal, and that's pending. I think we're going to get a lot of questions about, am I okay with taking money from Jane or Joe? And if this implies that as long as you get the person who's giving you the money to tell you that they're not a subcontractor of some proposal that's pending, but it doesn't really. It just means that you met your due diligence requirement, but you're still going to get an enforcement action by the committee. I want to make sure that we're clear on that when we send this over to the board. Or no, this doesn't go to the board. These are just regs, right? It does go to the board. I'm sorry. I didn't realize they adopt the regs.
No, when these are transmitted to the Board of Supervisors, the Board of Supervisors is not required to have any separate action or vote on the proposed regulation.
Okay.
The board
Right.
could
They're
theoretically
notified.
reject the regulations.
Okay. Well, in any event, I do think it's important to clarify that, because I anticipate that we are going to get a lot of puzzled folks out there on this. There's the other thing I was going to ask you, in fact, is for purposes of 1.26 or 126, agency seeking to enter into a contract means the city department that has purchasing authority for the contractor agreement. Under the charter, city administrative office, the purchaser, right below that in 1.1268, notification by city departments. So the city department's required to notify the Ethics Commission every time it gets a proposal for a contract that has a value of more than $100,000, and that includes modifications of existing contracts of more than $100,000. Contracts at that size might not even go to the board. I mean, you're going to be working with a lot of departments, DPW, PUC, Port, who have a lot of these contracts, who are going to try and figure out how do they comply. So I'm just wondering, have you had any conversations with the city administrator or the purchaser about what they have to do to meet their obligation?
So one thing I wanted to point out is that this F2 requirement does only apply to contracts that will require that approval by the board. So it says has a total anticipated value of $100,000 or more and will require approval by a city elective officer. So I shouldn't have said the board, but it requires the approval of a city elective officer. Only those such contracts would warrant or trigger the F2.
So the board, the DA, the mayor, the city attorney, public defender. Okay.
Correct.
And then, so for all those other departments, it's only going to be $10 million contracts and $100,000 modifications to, or $500,000 modifications to those contracts.
Correct. Yeah, and only if it required approval.
Right. There's shockingly large number of contracts that are over $10 million. I still think you really, as a service to yourself and the city departments who are going to want to be in compliance with the Ethics Commission, I would definitely do a reach out to them specifically that's beyond just the public.
Yes, definitely. We're in the process of doing that. I think implementing this 1.162 F2, or sorry, 1.126 F2 notice requirement and the F4 requirement, which is when the elected official actually approves the contract. That also triggers a notice to the Ethics Commission. Implementing both of these is a pretty crucial part and also a somewhat difficult part of this code section because it requires that cooperation and coordination with other departments, but that's definitely something that we're working on and figuring out from a business process standpoint, what's the best way to allow them to do it in an effective way that actually creates the kind of information that the code section seeks to make available, which is just a list of bidders and contractors so that someone contemplating making or accepting a contribution is able to look that information up and know whether or not the contribution would be prohibited. So I definitely think that we'll be continuing to work with other departments moving forward on this one.
Yeah, I mean, that would be quite an interesting database because it doesn't exist now.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Okay. Other comments, questions? Okay. So I would move to approve these revised regulations as attached in Agenda Item 5 with the addition of the Agenda Item 5, regulations supporting campaign and governmental conduct code, staff's proposed amendments based on public comment that we received today, plus the two changes that Mr. Ford previously had identified on Agenda Item 5, page 21, in Regulation 1.126-7, contributor information, in the very second full paragraph, first full sentence, by replacing 10% shareholder with the words greater than 10% owner. And then on Agenda Item 5, page 24, Regulation 1.142-5, process for establishing eligibility, irrevocability of decision to participate or not participate, withdrawal of declaration, subsection A. In the third line, after the words filing nomination papers, striking the period and replacing with a comma, and deleting the words, under state law, a candidate must file his or her nomination papers no later than the 88th days prior to the election. And then simply continuing on with the additional underscored text. Is there, Commissioner Lee has a second? We just do a voice, what do you want to do?
So it sounds like the chair would like to do a roll call vote on the motion as seconded by Commissioner Lee.
Yes.
Commissioner Smith?
Aye.
Commissioner Smith votes aye. Commissioner Ambrose?
Aye.
Commissioner Ambrose votes aye. Commissioner Lee?
Aye.
Commissioner Lee votes aye, and Chair Chu?
Aye.
Chair Chu votes aye. The motion is approved, 4-0, with all 4 members voting in the affirmative. Thank you.
Okay. Agenda item number 6, discussion of the monthly staff policy report. This is the Pat Ford show today.
For not being here last month.
Right.
Getting even with them.
I'm here all week. Thank you, Chair Chu, Commissioners. Agenda item 6, I will make very brief. This is our monthly update for the policy division. The big news here is that we're losing Brian. Brian Cox is leaving our office and going back to the public defender's office from whence he came for a new and exciting position that has been created specifically for him to do criminal law policy. He learned so much in the 3.5 months here that he now has policy positions created for him in other departments.
But why? Why would you want to leave?
So, with that fact in mind, and with new developments on both the public financing front and the CFRO regs front, the memo here, or report, proposes a plan forward with the policy division that basically would encompass 3 policy projects at this point. Policy project 1 would remain the public financing project. At this point, you've now approved an ordinance. So I will be working with Mr. Shen to finalize that ordinance, send it to the board. We'll be seeking a sponsor for the ordinance. I believe that Supervisor Marr is willing to sponsor that ordinance. So we'll be continuing to work with his office and trying to gather support amongst the members of the Board of Supervisors to approve this ordinance. It will require 8 out of 11 votes, would first go to the Rules Committee. So there will be a process with this ordinance. So I definitely want to continue to be engaged on that, provide the Commission's perspective on this piece of legislation, and that's definitely going to take some time. So I propose keeping that as the main policy project for the time being. Likewise, with the regulation amendments that you just approved at this point, Andrew and I will be working in those final amendments that you approved today to create one final version, transmitting that to the board so that the board has the option for 60 days to call a hearing on those regulations. At the end of that period, assuming that nothing happens during the 60 days, we would then move into an implementation phase of making sure that all of the different sets of regs on our website are updated. I'd be working with staff to make sure that they're aware of all of the changes, that any documents or forms reflect these changes, and all around making sure that these go into full effect and affect all of our processes in the office. So that would be a continuing process. Not no work really for 2 months while they sit, but then starting in July would be kind of picking these up again and doing an implementation phase together with other divisions in the office. And then thirdly, the Form 700 e-filing for all project is something that our office has kind of had in development for a number of months. This again is the idea of having all filers of the Form 700 file electronically. Currently, only members of boards and commissions, elected officers, and department heads file electronically, meaning that they actually go into the system on an electronic interface and fill it out. Everyone else files on paper, which can mean that they're on their computer filling data into a PDF, but when they submit it, they actually print it and hand it to someone in their office, and it stays in a filing cabinet in their office. So this project would be to convert all filers into that uniform online interface for filing the Form 700. And it's a fairly significant project that involves collaboration with a lot of different divisions within the office, and frankly, with a lot of different departments within the city. I think that we're, at this point, I think we've probably met with, I don't know, I want to say 8 to 10 different departments to talk to them and work with them on how we can implement this project. So it's still in development at this point, but I think that we foresee hopefully moving forward with this over the summer and starting to talk to more departments and to talk with potentially employee bargaining units about the impact this would have on city employees who would now be required to use this different system, and potentially to start looking at regulations that we want to bring before the commission that would require electronic filing. So at this time, policy, or up until this time, policy has been assisting the other divisions in these talks with other departments, and is starting to think about what a process plan would be. But I think as the project moves beyond development and starts to go towards the true project phase, I foresee having a more active role, especially as it pertains to any meet and discuss that we would do with employee bargaining units. That's something that policy would be heavily engaged on, or if and when this project comes to the point of regulations, that's something that policy would be heavily engaged on. So at this point, it's my plan to have that as kind of the third policy project to round out that portfolio of 3 projects of implementing the public financing, or I should say, continuing to promote the public financing reforms, and then if they are approved, helping to implement them, implementing the CFO regulations, and then assisting with bargaining unit negotiations and regulation drafting for this Form 700 project. I think since I will, for the foreseeable future, be a one-man operation, once again, that is probably more than enough to keep me occupied between now and, frankly, the fall. I think that these projects, each of them have at least a 3 to 6 month lifespan, with the Form 700 one having a vastly longer lifespan to be determined, but definitely enough to keep me busy for a while. There are some other updates in here. The one that I wanted to highlight is the paid online political communications project. Brian actually contributed a great webpage to our website that is our attempt to help the public understand how online communications, online political communications, are paid for. As you remember, this project was to try and find ways to help people understand when they see a political ad on Facebook or Twitter, help them understand who's paying for it. Where is that coming from? So this webpage, which there's a URL here in the report, in the footnote 2, the page explains kind of some of the fundamentals of campaign finance in terms of what's a committee, what committees pay for communications, and how do I find what committee paid for this. It talks about disclaimers. It talks about how to use the committee name to then use the dashboards on our website to look that committee up and see how is the committee funded and how is it spending its money, et cetera. And then it also talks about what do you do if you see an ad that doesn't have a disclaimer, but it's promoting a San Francisco candidate or measure, and it provides our office phone number and says to contact the enforcement division for a potential disclaimer violation. So we see this as an important way to help the public who, especially those who might not be aware of campaign finance law and the general structure of 460s and committees, help them have some kind of entry point into this world that's straightforward, that's a self-contained single web page, and that's specifically tailored towards electronic media users, people who are maybe not watching TV or radio, but who are really tuned into social media and email and that kind of stuff. So we think this will be a huge step forward. We're going to monitor the traffic on this site. Hopefully we'll get some feedback from people, but we think that this is a good way to make some progress in this area. So I'd like to thank Brian for taking the lead on that project. But with that, glad to take any questions that you might have And otherwise, I think I'm done.
Any questions from commissioners? Commissioner Lee?
Just a quick question. Can I assume that the paid online communication section is going to be translated in the different languages that you already have in your website?
We have not had that page translated yet. It's something that we could definitely look into. Are there particular languages?
I would strongly suggest the Chinese language be translated. I mean, be included in this, because a lot of the ads are popping up in the Chinese social media.
Okay, I will look into that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Public comment on this staff policy report? There being none. Agenda item number 7, discussion of monthly staff enforcement report, including an update on various programmatic and operational highlights of the enforcement program's activities since the last monthly meeting.
Thank you, Chair Chu and Commissioners. Pleased to be with you today. This month's report highlights some investments that the Commission is making in the Enforcement Division staff, investments that I think will pay significant dividends in the Division's ability to fulfill its mandate and to bring to resolution the matters that we are continuing to identify with you as being of particular priority to this Commission. So specifically, the Commission invested money to send 2 of our senior investigators to a training at the end of April. That training took place in New Orleans, and it was hosted by a entity of the federal executive branch, the Federal Council on Inspectors General. So Jeff and Thomas were there in New Orleans, surrounded by federal investigators who work in the various offices of the Inspectors General, in addition to a small number of individuals who, like themselves, work in local jurisdictions. They received training from attorneys from the U.S. Department of Justice, including its Public Integrity Unit, as well as attorneys from the U.S. Office of Government Ethics. Those presentations covered legal issues, in particular affecting public corruption, campaign finance, and other issues that, as I said, we are in the process of identifying as the Commission's highest priorities. I think if you were to speak to the investigators, what they would tell you is that what was most useful to them and heartening to them was the amount of time that they spent learning through case studies, and that the process of hearing how investigators at the federal level brought a case from complaint to resolution gave them a lot of insight into the work that they do on a day-to-day basis, and it also inspired them to think maybe even more with more clear-headedness about the kinds of complaints that the Commission should convert into open investigations, and also the way that the Commission might focus the use of its investigative resources in investigating something that they have converted into an open investigation, which is to say, bringing a particularly acute awareness of the allegations at the core of the complaint, and really focusing in on those particular allegations and on the allegations that we are most likely to be able to prove. So I would encourage you, if you have opportunity, to catch those investigators and hear firsthand about their experience in New Orleans. Also, in terms of professional development, the division was fortunate to receive a briefing from Senior Investigator Eric Willett about the kinds of tools and methods available to the division for conducting what we call an investigative audit, which is to apply the methods and tools of auditing to a particular complaint that alleges violations of campaign finance law. So effectively, it is a mini audit that is targeted to specific allegations, or targeted to, say, preliminary evidence that we believe could indicate unlawful activity. So I think you know already that Eric spent several years with the commission as an auditor before he enforcement division, and so he was able to draw on his expertise from his time there in helping the rest of our team to understand a little bit better what tools are available to us when we dig in on certain kinds of campaign finance violations. The report, as always, provides an update for you on statistics. I would note that remaining in preliminary review now are equipment failure. Remaining in preliminary review are 57 matters, down from 75 last month. That is still more than we had this time a year ago, but we are moving back toward where we were at a time before the city hosted 2 elections within a single calendar year. Granted, we'd like to bring the amount of time that it takes us to complete, on average, those preliminary reviews down. You'll see that we're still hovering around 7.5 months to evaluate whether the commission has jurisdiction or intends to invest investigative resources into a complaint. But we're heartened that the number of matters that the investigators have to review is diminishing, because ultimately that means that we have more resources to spend on investigations as opposed to triaging whether we intend to investigate at all. We do still have a pretty hardy number of investigations on the division's docket. We have 88 as compared to 87 last month. Again, on average, the amount of time that it's taking the division to get through a particular investigation and bring it all the way to resolution, whether that's securing a settlement or closing it in the interest of justice or determining that the evidence suggests that there is not probable cause, is still hovering just under 15 months. The Commission's fines collection officer continues to work to collect late fees that the Commission has assessed against filers in the campaign finance context. I think I reported to you last month that she was beginning to prepare, or had already prepared, the first round of warning letters to filers with outstanding late fees. She has now sent 2 rounds of warning letters to delinquent filers and is preparing a third round even now. She has also collected a substantial amount of unpaid late fees in the process. She has referred 4 delinquent filers to the Bureau of Delinquent Revenue, which the charter requires the commission to do when somebody owes money to the commission and has declined or otherwise refused to pay it. And she will continue to make those referrals as filers from the second round and ultimately from the third round remain delinquent. Not a lot of movement on the efforts of BDR to secure payment on the 5 matters before them that we have reported to you every month. In particular, the 2 matters involving Chris Jackson have not really moved, nor the matter involving Jacqueline Norman. The Bureau is trying to sue Isabel Urbano. They note that they have mailed an intent to file a lawsuit letter to all known addresses of that individual. But what that means is they don't know whether that individual actually occupies any of those addresses or will receive those letters. They are exploring ways to serve process on Isabel Urbano. And then finally, I would note that regarding Lynette Sweet, which is the largest of the outstanding fees that arose from, you'll remember, a hearing on the merits against that respondent. The note here indicates that that there is litigation that the city has filed against Ms. Sweet, and that there was to have been a case management conference today, in fact. I spoke with an attorney from the Bureau today, and her update is that that case management conference has been continued, meaning postponed to August, to allow additional time for briefing. But I can report that the Bureau has had direct conversation with Lynette Sweet. She exists. She is alive. She is ready to be engaged with. We will have to make some decisions going forward about what kind of process the commission wants the Bureau to engage in, including whether we would permit the Bureau to settle that matter for less than the amount of penalties that the order set forth, which is a conversation that we can have in the future.
Can I ask a quick question, though?
Yeah.
It's in bankruptcy court, right, though? I mean, isn't that what the proceeding is? So I'll be surprised if the city can settle with her outside of bankruptcy court.
It says here the bankruptcy's been dismissed.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, I think she filed twice for bankruptcy, and each time it was dismissed, I believe because she did not adequately follow up on her own filings. I can double check what I received from the Bureau recently, but I believe that I received a complaint from the Bureau that they had filed in Superior Court. But I will double check on what kind of litigation that is and what the status it is.
Yeah, I guess the note isn't clear. It says the court has set a case management conference for bankruptcy, which is, you're right, inconsistent with what's on the previous page, which says there is no bankruptcy. So, yeah, if you can, I'm just, when you bring it back, if we can talk about exactly what the procedural status is.
I will. Thank you for the question. And then lastly, I would note that we have included this month a third attachment that has not been traditionally a part of this report. This attachment provides, I think, greater perspective on the remainder of the statistics that we report to you on a monthly basis. So ordinarily what you get in attachments 1 and 2 is a breakdown of the age of matters in preliminary review and under investigation and the kinds of matters that those are. And then the statistics near the top of the report, which compare current stats to the prior month and to the prior year. What we have in attachment 3 is a snapshot of the data that we started collecting 3 years ago. So what you see here is a 3-year picture into what the Enforcement Division has done, at least in terms of the specific quantitative data that we started collecting in April of 2016, which we had not collected prior to that time. You will have seen versions of these graphs previously, I think probably in the Executive Director's report or in budget requests to the Mayor's office. Prior versions of these graphs included additional data like the size of the Enforcement Division staff or the time of elections that the city has hosted. Those data points give some additional insight into the circumstances that affect the size of the division's docket and the pace of the division's work. But I think what you can see from this expanded 3-year view is that the numbers are prone to fluctuation, in part due to those outside circumstances that I just identified, or outside or inside circumstances, but also that what we have now is that with fewer matters in preliminary review and more matters under investigation, we hope that the division is better able to allocate its resources to fulfilling the mandate of resolving investigations, finding liability, securing punitive value, providing deterrent value. We hope to maintain that. Of course, we can't predict what effect subsequent elections will have or potential staffing changes may have on the division's ability to create its mandate. But looking at the data from a 3-year perspective is one tool among a handful of tools that we have at our disposal as we advance conversations that we touched on in the April meeting regarding what kinds of priorities the Commission wants to assign to the Enforcement Division and whether, for example, the Commission wants to expand the kinds of matters that the Division handles by fixed penalty, this accelerated streamlined process that allows the Division to resolve a greater number of those matters that require little to no investigation. Some of those are maybe reporting violations, but some of them may even be conduct violations if, again, they're not subject to need of significant investigation. So we have initiated internally conversations about what those priorities might be and what kinds of additional violations we could add to the fixed penalty policy. We look forward to expanding that conversation and bringing some recommendations before you as commissioners soon. I do believe that the fixed penalty policy will require your input to amend, because the commission did adopt that policy previously. But as to enforcement priorities, I don't believe that a regulation or a policy is necessary, only that we have a shared understanding of what that might look like.
So at the next meeting, I hope and expect that we'll have a fifth commissioner. And so I think as a good level setting, for his first meeting and also for us as a full commission, I think it would be very helpful, Mr. Pierce, if you could lead us through the, provide a snapshot maybe at a high level of the current caseload of types of cases. So, and how many are for disclosure, how many are retaliation, or just a high level view. And then come forth with your recommendations on what you think the priorities should be for the enforcement division, because the resources are finite, and as is time, and so we cannot, as my old boss used to say, boil the ocean. And so, with these limited resources, what is the highest and best use of the time, staff, and the energy to best protect the interests of integrity, transparency, accountability, and do right by the people of San Francisco. And I think it would be a good discussion to have, and to help bring clarity to the work, and to say, well, this type of case is we don't have the resources to be able to go after it, because there are bigger fish to fry. Because I think those are the trade-offs that any enforcement division, any organization needs to make, because it's just not possible to do everything in today's world. And I think that with that clarity and I would like to hear from my fellow commissioners, and as we have this discussion, I think that we need to put our trust in you and your team to exercise the discretion to say, we don't have the resources, or it seems like a viable case, but I don't think we can prove it, right? I don't think we could get to the outcome that we would want. And so for, lack of prosecutorial resources, lack of sufficient evidence, we're going to close it. And I think that, being clear in that direction, could be helpful, to you to be able to bring to bear that judgment, because you'll be closest to the facts. But I hope that my fellow commissioners would join in that discussion to help and so that we can all collectively get clear on what's important, because I think that there are disclaimer, to your point about expanding the fixed penalty provisions with it, which I think is a fantastic idea. The font size on a slate mailer from an election in 2015 weighed against an illegal coordination investigation. I would much rather that you and the team focus on illegal coordination and then deal with the slate mailer font size, through a more routine process, or not at all. But I think that would be a great discussion for us to have as a commission, and then you could then be charged, the team, to go out and tackle the backlog, and then really bring to bear the resources that you needed on those cases that go to the heart of the integrity of our system.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, great. Any public comment? I don't think the public left to comment. And then, where's my agenda? All right, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item number 8, discussion of Executive Director's Report, an update of various programmatic and operational highlights of Ethics Commission staff activities since the Commission's last monthly meeting.
Thank you, Chair Chu. There are several updates that I've asked our Deputy Director to join me for to provide an overview of the budget process and where we are with that. I also wanted to ask Ms. Tykendale to provide a bit more detailed information about the work that's ongoing in the Engagement and Compliance Division with our expanded resources. As you heard earlier, we have a number of new laws that are being implemented, and Gayatri and her team are working very diligently to get that information out and to sort of size up what we need to support departments and filers with. So I'll let her talk about that. I just wanted to highlight a couple of brief items before I turn it over to her. As you heard Pat Ford discuss or mention in the policy report, this is Brian Cox's last day on the staff and day in the office and his last meeting with us. We are delighted that he's got the opportunity to do work that is his passion in the public defender's office. We know all of us have enjoyed his presence and are all the better for the heavy lifting that he's done with Pat Ford over the past several months. So we wish him the best. We're disappointed to see him leave, but we know it's an exciting time to be doing important work in that capacity as well. We will be hiring over the next few months. It seems like it's a mode that we remain in. We have a number of positions that we're still looking to launch our hiring for now as we turn towards the end of this fiscal year for a front office senior clerk. We also have an auditor position, an investigator position, and then, of course, now the policy position. So we can talk a bit more in detail about how we'll be doing that, but we are going to remain for the foreseeable future in a bit of a hiring mode. We are glad that we have the assistance and insights of the Department of Human Resources to work with us closely in that process. But as you know, it is a process, and it takes some time. We hope to use our insights from over the last year or two to make that a very effective process. I would also just note two things in terms of commission logistics. Chair Chu just mentioned that there may be a new commissioner for the next meeting. I believe, as you know, there was a Rules Committee hearing a week or two ago, and the Board of Supervisors has moved forward the recommendation that Lateef Gray be appointed to the commission as the Board of Supervisors appointee. I believe the latest we heard was that that nomination may be considered June 4th by the full board, and presumably if that goes well, then he would be sworn in and be sitting for the meeting in June. On that front, we have also updated the June and July meeting dates in response to some conflicts that we had, so we will post this information on our website within the next day as well, so the public has information. But the next commission meeting for June was rescheduled to June the 28th, which is a Friday, and the July meeting was changed to the 31st, which is a Wednesday. So again, we will post that information and make sure that the public's well aware of it so that people can plan accordingly.
You say the 31st?
The 31st of July, yes. So with that, actually, I'll turn it over to Gayatri to ask for her to give us an update on the budget. And I'm happy to answer questions as well, and then also to drill down into some more of the really exciting and important work that's happening in the Engagement and Compliance Division that she heads.
Do you want me to talk about the budget as well?
Sure.
Okay. Hello again, Commissioners. As you know, over the last several months, we have been working with the Mayor's Office as well as the Controller's Office in figuring out the details for the various items that we have requested. The Mayor's Office will be publishing the budget by end of this week. And in our discussion with them, we have been able to identify various items that will be funded in the coming fiscal year. But at the same time, there were some items that we were unable to secure, and also some which were allocated just as a one-time funding for the next fiscal year. So just to give you a brief update on what those changes were, we had requested THR consulting services to support our HR-related needs and hiring needs. As Director Pelham just mentioned earlier, we heavily rely on DHR services to ensure that our staffing is done on track, and also, to address anything that comes up on a day-to-day basis. So we had requested $97,200 for next year's services, and we were able to secure only $37,000. So we will be continuing the conversation with the mayor's office in the upcoming year to see if there are other ways in which we can secure additional funds as needed.
Yeah, what would the reduction, which is like 2/3, what's the reduction impact
in
to your hiring ability?
Yes. Just from a full-time FTE perspective, we had requested about half an FTE of a DHR consultant. And I believe now what we have, including the baseline budget that we already have for this item, I think we'll get about 30% of a full-time person. That could slow down our hiring to some extent. We're going to be working out a hiring plan for all the 4 positions that are currently open. The other option, if available next year, would be if we have salary savings that happen in the next fiscal year, that may be something we can try to reallocate if the mayor's office approves that type of a change. So
So if there's salary savings from, say, Brian's position being open, and from the investigator and the auditor positions being open, we would still need to get approval from the mayor's office to reallocate those savings to use towards a recruiter from HR to help us?
That is correct. So our plan is to closely monitor these funds in the upcoming fiscal year. We're also going to try and continue with our hiring plan actively, per our timeline. As we get closer to the funds allocated, we're going to engage in a conversation again with the mayor's office and see if we can get additional funds allocated. So yeah, we're going to try our best to minimize the impact on our operations for sure. So that's the DHR consulting services. We had also asked for additional funds for supporting technology-related needs. This includes additional software licenses, license increase costs, laptops, and technical services from Department of Technology, as well as DocuSign. So in total, all of that had accounted to about $62,200. We were able to secure $49,700, but only as a one-time funding. So what this means is that next year in the funding cycle, we will again present these asks, and hopefully we'll try to get that included as a part of our baseline budget, so that year after year we know that we have continued funds to support these operational needs. Aside from that, we had personnel-related requests. We had requested reclassification of 3 positions, 1 position in the Engagement and Compliance Division, 1 in the Audit Division, and Enforcement Division. The Audit and Enforcement Division requests we were not able to secure those changes, so at this point we're going to proceed as is. You may recall that we had also created a project for continuing e-filing and data disclosure work, which was not funded by COIT. We were able to secure funding for that position for 1 year through general funds. So we have mentioned to the mayor's office that this is a continued need, and we will be bringing up this need again in the upcoming fiscal year. So,
will the fact that they funded year one of a 3-year project, will that help us next year in the budgeting process?
I would hope so,
because otherwise the alternative would be it stops. I mean, unless we were able to shift funds around to be able to cover the shortfall, and plus it's a person who's already been hired.
Yes, I think in terms of our plan or deliverables, we're going to prioritize the things that are most critical for the upcoming year. But also, we know that there is a need for this type of work because, as you can see, there's a lot of focus on e-filing and disclosure. So we want to again present this need in the upcoming cycle to continue that work.
So the last question I had about the budget is that since it will be presented to the Board of Supervisors, is there any chance that at that meeting that numbers are changed and that money is reallocated, or is this more of a pro forma kind of formality that the board goes through?
There is always the city's add-back process that the Board of Supervisors can engage in. That is not something that we have attempted to do in the past. My sense is that it is important to draw the Board of Supervisors' attention to the need that we have when we're producing new legislation and new rules in the city to actually fund them so that they can be regularly funded and actually implemented fully. I think some of the struggle that we have is that we've had a number of legislative changes over the last several years, but there hasn't been a lot of additional funding. So that's something that it will be an opportunity to remind the board about. It is not my expectation that I would be at the board asking them to add back in items. I think that we will be in a much stronger position if we needed to do that next year, once we have been able to demonstrate the resources, with the resources that we have and that we've been able to fill the work that we're doing. I think it's a bit harder when we've had empty seats and we haven't been able to successfully fill them to go in and ask for more. That's not a persuasive ask in my mind. So it's not the ideal situation that we want to be in. But I think it's clear that we have some technologies and people in place to be able to really produce much more than we've been able to in the last several years. So my hope is that we can do that effectively and persuasively and look very rigorously at what next year's budget needs to look like.
Great. Anything else?
Okay. Moving on to the engagement and compliance program updates. With an expanded team now, we've been able to provide deeper focus on our day-to-day operations and also make more progress on the new laws, implementing and operationalizing new laws. So we wanted to highlight some of the activities that we've been focused on in the last few months and just give you some updates on different programmatic areas. So just to start with, for the annual Statement of Economic Interest filings, Form 700, we provided a brief update to you last month about our compliance activities. I just wanted to give you an update of the current status of compliance rates at this point. For the Form 700 filings, we are at a compliance percentage of 96, and for ethics and sunshine training, we're at 92. Over the last month and a half, the engagement and compliance team has been working very closely with departments and filing officers and filers to try and get them to comply. In the process, we've also seen that many of the filers who are in our system, they actually don't have a filing requirement. They don't have an annual filing requirement because they may have left office. And so we've been cleaning up our system quite a bit as well. And that's been a challenge with this program, just to be notified timely when people leave office. So, which is why we had to, keep following up and make sure that we have the right information in the system. We do provide notices before the deadline and remind filing officers to, notify us about changes. But that's something that we've learned that's something we have to keep proactively doing, and we will continue to do that as well. So that's the current status of the CI filings. We will be following up with the remaining filers and ensure that we get them into compliance as well. In addition to this, we're also keeping track of assuming office filers as and when new officers get appointed.
Our upcoming commissioner.
Yes.
I have a question. So failure to file Form 700 incurs penalties. Are there any consequences for failing to complete the ethics and sunshine training?
The disqualification rule applies for them, yes. So the late fees applies to the Form 700, but yes.
And then I know that the percentage of filers kind of fluctuates. I believe it was 90 plus something last year. Is there a goal that we set? Obviously 100%, but is 100% achievable? I mean, like what does good look like in a citywide filing situation like this?
I think that is a good question. We have been tracking our annual filing percentages every year, and 96 is certainly at the
on the top end. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. I think Personally, I would say 100%. That is what at least we're trying to achieve. But I do know that, realistically, there may be a percentage that we need to target. We have not done a comparison with other cities. That may be something that I can check to see if there's some standard that.
Right. I mean, 96% is extremely high, and obviously 100% would be ideal, but closing the gap on the 4% is, what is the 4% made up of? Is it people who have left the city, and, is it a database cleanup on our end that we need to do, or, what else? So, like, how much more effort is required to get to that?
I would say that in the last couple of months, most of the issues that we noticed were basically people who've left office and we haven't received notification. So that's been the huge portion of the filers that, at least when we pulled the stats the day after the deadline, we saw a very different number. And then when we sent out the late filing notices or non-filing notices to filers, that's when we started receiving updates about people have left office. Even though we have sent out communications even previously, I think when they received a notice saying you cannot participate on your board or commission, I think that got their attention. But what I'm hoping is that we're also trying to put processes in place so that we can maintain our system more proactively on a regular basis. And one of the things we also want to do is more communication out to the departments and filing officers so that they also get regular reminders to notify us when there are changes. So there's certainly a lot of different areas that we're looking into. I'm hoping that as we learn and improve our processes, that will also automatically help with the compliance. And we can certainly,
and certainly bear that in mind as we add more filers next year as we roll out the e-filing for everyone.
Absolutely, yes, and that's something we'll also be looking at our outreach, communications, online materials, as we start rolling this out to more filers. All right, so moving on to a brief update on the lobbying program. As you know, you saw John Kim at our meeting in last month. He has been the program administrator for the lobbying program. And over the last few months, ever since he started, he has been able to manage this program a bit more proactively and closely. And every month, lobbyists have to file monthly reports with us. In the last month, we have a very high compliance percentage, as you can see. Out of the 192 active lobbyists, only one filer didn't file the form, and that too because that filer had actually left their position. So we were not able to reach them. So this is just an update, and ongoingly we'll keep you informed about these program activities. I want to move on to ACAO implementation, as there are a lot of suggestions and ideas that were shared in the meeting today. We are diligently working on implementing the different provisions of this law. A big focus of our team over the last few months has been on building out the different forms. So as a part of this ACAO implementation, we have to build out 10 new forms. Right now, we have completed 8 forms. Many of them have been implemented electronically already. We only have 2 more that's already in progress. So the plan is to complete the implementation and rollout of these forms in the coming weeks. We're also looking into outreach and communication for the various different filers who need to be filing these forms with us. And I know I briefly mentioned this in the earlier update. In addition to building out the forms, we are also building out online web content. We're also updating our guides, and we're putting together communications to describe these new requirements. So our team is working on all these different activities right now. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time as we were building the forms. Was, we put a lot of thought into the design of the form because we wanted to make sure that it's a consistent look and feel. The forms look the same, the filing experience is the same, so that it's easier for people to file these forms. We've also been providing assistance to filers as they've been calling in if they have questions about this process. So, the team is actively working on operationalizing this, and we've been collaborating with the policy division and enforcement and technology division as well. So, in addition to ACAO, I wanted to briefly talk about the election update as well, because both of them are interconnected. Because one of the ways in which we want to provide more information to filers is through training. And we have scheduled candidate and treasurer training for June 6th. We're also working on the Public Financing Ordinance Phase 1 implementation, which will be effective June 9th. So I think as we're looking at outreach and communication, we're looking at all these different pieces of information that we need to provide to the same audience, such that we can coordinate and come up with a timeline for how we want to schedule these communications. So we're planning to do a lot of the outreach and communication in June, and then that's the timeline we're working towards at this point. Any questions on ACAO at this point? No? Okay. Moving on to a brief update on trustee elections reporting. As you know, this is again a new law that went into effect this year. There were 2 elections scheduled this month, the Retiree Healthcare Trust Fund Board and Health Service Board. The Health Service Board election was canceled as they didn't have enough participants in their election. And for the Retiree Healthcare Trust Fund Board, our engagement and compliance team, Johnny Ozzie, has been working with filers and also providing communication and training materials and online guides. So we've been working with the filers for all the pre-election filings. The election ended yesterday, so soon after that we'll be working with the filers to make sure that they terminate the committees as needed. So that's, again, a close focus for the team. And moving on to election update, I know I talked about this briefly earlier. Our team is working on putting together the training material for June 6th, and also working with the policy team to make sure that all of the guides and online resources are up to date before the training, and also in line with the ACAO communication plan. So that's a lot of interesting, good work happening.
Really important work.
Any questions?
I think that's. Do you expect the $220 of the late filing fees for that number to go up, or is that is this reflecting the 4% who haven't filed?
Yeah. So for the SCI late fee process, we're actually working with the enforcement team, Jeff's team, to redesign some of those processes. So we're expecting to see that number go up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Commissioner Ambrose.
I did want to make sure that we don't bypass the staff news and have an opportunity to thank Brian. Since his last day is May 31st, we won't have the pleasure of your company here anymore, and we do want to thank you for your contributions and at least for a very short period of time, giving faith and hope to the staff that there were resources coming to their aid. So not to guilt trip you on your way out the door, we do wish you great good fortune and good work with the public defender, but want to make sure we acknowledge your efforts while you were here. Thank you.
Echo what Vice Chair Ambrose has said. It was way too short. You sure you won't change your mind? But thank you for all your contributions, the hard work. I know Pat relied on you tremendously. I really enjoyed working with you and wish it could have been longer. But you made a difference. You helped us pass an ordinance today that is going to hopefully empower a lot more grassroots candidates and disperse more funds out through the public financing program. So you should be really proud of the work that you did to help make that happen. And best of luck to you in the Public Defender's Office. And but if you change your mind, you can always come back. So there's call for public comment. There being none.
Public is deserved.
It's just us chickens. Agenda item number 9, discussion and possible action items for future meetings. No. Public comment. There being none. 10, additional opportunity for public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda pursuant to Ethics Commission Bylaws, Article 7, Section 2. There being none. Motion to adjourn.
I think that's a very good idea. I second that.